Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Come in from the cold hallway and let the door close soft behind you. Take a slow breath in and let it go slower still. And let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding on. There is nothing tonight that needs your attention. There is nowhere to be but here, in the dark, listening. Tonight we are going back a very long way, to a world before electric light, before the clock on the wall, before anyone thought to measure sleep in hours the way we do now. We are going to spend one long medieval night together, from a walled garden at dusk to a bell that rang in the coldest hour before dawn. And along the way we will gather up, one by one, 100 small and quiet things the old world used to close its eyes. A sponge soaked in poppy and mandrake, a root pulled from the earth by moonlight, a warm cup of spiced milk passed from hand to hand at a fireside, a silence kept so completely that even a whisper felt like a kind of trespass, a bell rung in the black middle of the night, calling tired men out of their beds to sing, and then, gently, back into them again. None of this needs remembering. There will be no test at the end of it, no list to recite in the morning. You may let each small thing arrive, sit with you a moment, and drift on. The way smoke drifts from a snuffed candle. If your eyes close long before we reach the end, that will not trouble me in the least. That, in fact, is rather the point of an apothecary who deals only in sleep. So let the room grow dim around you, and let your body settle a little heavier into wherever it is resting, and come with me now through a low wooden gate into a walled garden, just as the light is beginning to leave the sky. The garden we are entering belonged, in one form or another, to almost every monastery, manor house, and market town in the medieval world, and it was never planted for pleasure alone. It was a working garden, laid out in long raised beds so the soil would drain and warm faster than the surrounding fields, each bed given over to a particular family of complaints. One bed for the herbs that cooled a fever, one for the herbs that eased a cough, one set a little apart from the rest, behind its own low fence, for the plants that could heal in a careful hand and harm in a careless one. The keeper of such a garden, whether a monk trained in the infirmary or a housewife who had learned her craft from her mother, walked its paths every evening with a woven basket, deciding by eye and by smell what the night's remedies would require. It is into that walking, that quiet evening rounds, that we are stepping now. Near the garden's northern wall, where the last of the sun lingers longest, grows a plant whose flower nods on a long, thin stem, pale where the light catches its papery petals. This is the poppy, and in a Physic garden of the old world, it was planted with no more ceremony than the beans or the onions, tucked among the beds as though it were nothing unusual at all. Only the keeper of the garden knew which of the poppies growing there were the milder red field poppy, good for little more than a cough syrup, and which were the paler garden poppy, whose swelling seed heads held, just beneath the skin, the milky substance that could carry a person down into the deepest and longest sleep the century knew. We will return to that milk before the night is through. For now it is enough to notice it standing there, unremarkable among the cabbages, keeping its great quiet secret. A little further along, growing tall and untidy against the garden wall, its small pink and white flowers giving off a smell some found sweet and others found faintly unpleasant, stood Valerian. It was not the flower that mattered to the herbalist, but the root beneath it, thick and pale, dug up in the cooling days of autumn and dried carefully out of the sun. Physicians of the age called it all heal, for there seemed no end to what a tired mind or a restless body could be given it for. And among its quieter uses was simply this, that a small dose of the dried and steeped root, taken as the household settled for the night, was thought to loosen whatever knot of worry kept a person turning in their bed. Trained up along a wooden trellis near the garden's eastern corner, climbed a vigorous, twisting vine, its pale green cones hanging in loose clusters by late summer. This was the hop, and it had been grown for generations chiefly to keep beer from spoiling on long journeys, and through long winters, its natural bitterness holding off the sorring that plain barley brew was prone to. It was only slowly, over the centuries, that brewers and herbalists alike began to notice something beyond its preserving power, a heaviness of the eyelids that seemed to follow a cup of hop laced all more reliably than a cup of the older, unhopped kind, long before anyone wrote the word medicine beside it. The hop had already begun to earn its place among the garden's night herbs, lining the gravel path itself, so that simply walking its length released a low cloud of scent around the ankles. Grew rows of lavender, its narrow grey-green leaves and violet spikes catching the last low light of the evening in a soft haze. Every household that could manage even a single row of it grew lavender near the door or along the path to the well, partly for its fragrance and partly because it was believed, quite correctly as it happens, to calm a restless nerve simply through the act of breathing it in. Cut in high summer and hung to dry in loose bundles from the rafters, it would find its way, before the season was out, into small linen bags tucked beneath a pillow, a use we will visit properly a little later in the night. Low along the border, spreading in a soft carpet that released an apple-like fragrance whenever a foot or a hem brushed against it, grew chamomile, one of the gentlest and most widely trusted herbs in the entire garden. It asked almost nothing of the person who used it, only that its small daisy-like flowers be gathered while still fresh, dried quickly out of direct sun, and steeped in hot water until the liquid took on a pale gold color. Given to fretful children before bed, and just as often to their equally fretful parents, chamomile carried none of the caution that surrounded the stronger sleep herbs of the garden. It was, in the language of the old herbals, a friend to the whole household, day or night. Set apart from every other bed, behind a low fence of its own, and often planted where the shade fell longest, grew a plant the garden's keeper approached with a different sort of care altogether. Its broad dark leaves spread close to the ground, and beneath the soil, unseen, grew a thick forked root that some who dug it claimed, in low voices, resembled the shape of a small crouching person. This was Mandrake, and even a garden that grew every other dangerous herb, without comment, kept a particular silence around this one. We will come back to its root, and to the strange rituals said to surround its harvest, once the night has grown a little older and a little darker. For now, the keeper of the garden simply walks past it, basket still half empty, eyes lowered a little out of old habit. There was, among herbalists of the age, a quiet and widely held belief that the hour at which a plant was gathered mattered nearly as much as the plant itself, and that the short hush of dusk, when the birds had gone quiet, but true darkness had not yet fallen, was the hour at which a night herb's virtue sat closest to the surface. So it was at this hour, and no other, that the garden's keeper made the evening rounds, moving bed to bed with a small curved knife and a woven basket, cutting a stem here, a handful of leaves there, murmuring sometimes a short private blessing over the work, more out of habit than doctrine. By the time the basket was full, and the last low light had gone violet over the wall, the gate would be pulled shut behind her, and the night's true work, indoors, by candlelight, could finally begin. That work began, more often than not, in a small low room set just off the kitchen, warm from the hearth on the other side of its wall, its beams hung thick with drying bundles of green turning slowly to brown. This was the still room, and in it, night after night through every gathering season, the raw abundance of the garden was turned, patiently and without haste, into something that could be kept, measured, and given. The bundles hanging from those beams were tied with plain twine, never too tightly, so that air could move freely through the drying leaves and stop them turning black with damp and mold. A household still room might hold 30 or 40 such bundles at once. Lavender beside chamomile, beside the tall dried stalks of valerian, each one turned gently every few days by whoever had the task, until the leaves had lost their moisture but kept, wherever possible, something of their color and their scent. It was slow work, entirely unhurried, for a leaf dried too quickly over open heat lost most of the very virtue it had been picked for. The still room took its name from the small copper still that stood, more often than not, in one corner of it, a squat vessel with a curved neck leading down into a waiting jar. Into this still went great armfuls of lavender or rose petals or fresh chamomile flowers, along with water, and over gentle coals the whole mixture was coaxed slowly into steam and back again, drop by drop, into a fragrant flower water far more concentrated than any simple tea could ever be. Lavender water made this way found its way onto a pillow's edge at bedtime, or dabbed at the temples of someone whose head would not stop its restless turning. In most households of any size, it was the women of the family, or a trusted housekeeper trained specifically for the task, who held responsibility over the still room, and it was a responsibility taken with real seriousness. A poorly kept still room, its herbs allowed to mold or its jars left unlabeled, could mean the difference between a remedy that worked as it should and one that did nothing at all, or worse, one that did the wrong thing entirely. The keeper of a good still room was trusted with a kind of quiet authority that reached well beyond the kitchen, and her knowledge, rarely written down in her own lifetime, was passed instead from a mother's hands to a daughter's, one evening at a time. Beyond the drying herbs and the flower waters, the still room was also where syrups were made, thick, sweetened preparations meant to make a bitter medicine bearable and to preserve its power for months at a time. A syrup of poppy, a syrup of violet, a syrup of the cooling garden lettuce, we will meet properly before long. All of these were simmered slowly with honey or sugar until they thickened, then poured while still warm into small clay jars and sealed against the air. A spoonful of such a syrup, stirred into warm water or taken alone on a restless night, could deliver in a moment what an entire cup of steeped herb might take an hour to achieve. Every jar and bundle that left the still room was marked, in whatever hand the household could manage, with a short label naming its contents, and often the season it had been gathered, for a wise keeper knew that memory alone could not be trusted across a long winter. Latin abbreviations were common in the households and monasteries that could read them, tidy little strings of letters that told a trained eye exactly what a jar contained and roughly how it ought to be used, while simpler households marked their pots with whatever symbols or private code made sense to the person doing the marking. Either way, the marking mattered enormously. For an unlabeled jar of dried herb, its color and its scent, both faded with age, could very quickly become a small dangerous mystery on a dark shelf. There was, too, an old and stubborn belief, held by herbalists across a great many regions and repeated in more than one surviving manuscript, that the moon's phase at the time of harvest shaped how well an herb would keep and how strong its remedy would prove once dried. Some swore by a waning moon for roots, believing the plant's strength had by then withdrawn downward into the earth, where the digging hands could reach it. Others insisted the opposite for leaves and flowers, gathered instead beneath a moon still growing toward its fullness. Whichever the household believed, the belief itself shaped the whole rhythm of the still room, so that certain nights of the month were simply known, without any real explanation needed, as good nights for this work and quiet nights for something else. By the time the last jar had been sealed and the last bundle hung to finish its slow drying, the fire in the kitchen beyond the wall would have burned down to a low red glow, and the still room itself would have gone dim and fragrant and still, ready to wait, patient as the garden outside its door, for whatever the coming weeks would ask of it. Leaving the still room behind, let us walk out along a narrow lane toward the center of the town, where a low shop with small thick window panes sits between a baker and a saddler, its door marked by a painted sign showing a pestle and a coiled serpent. This is the apothecary's shop, and stepping inside from the cool evening air, the first thing that reaches you is the smell. Dozens of dried herbs and resins and syrups all folding together into one warm, complicated scent that no single word could ever quite capture. The walls of such a shop were given over almost entirely to shelves, and the shelves to rows of jars, dozens upon dozens of them, in graduated sizes, each one holding a different root or leaf or prepared compound. Glass was costly in much of the medieval world, so many of these vessels were instead made of glazed pottery, their surfaces sometimes plain and sometimes painted with the name of their contents in a careful, practiced hand. A visitor standing in the middle of such a shop, turning slowly on the spot, would be looking, without quite realizing it, at the accumulated plant knowledge of centuries, arranged patiently within arm's reach. At the center of the counter, worn smooth by decades of steady use, sat the apothecary's mortar and pestle, often carved from a single block of stone or cast in bronze, heavy enough that it never shifted no matter how vigorously the pestle was worked against it. Roots, seeds, dried leaves, even small crystals of certain minerals, all passed through this simple pairing of tools on their way to becoming a usable remedy. The steady rhythmic sound of a pestle working against its mortar was, in a very real sense, the background music of medieval medicine, heard in one form or another in nearly every shop and every household still room across the continent. Beside the mortar stood a small brass balance, its two pans hanging from delicate chains, and beside that a fitted wooden box of tiny weights, each stamped with its value. Medicine in this period was measured not in the ounces and grams familiar to a modern kitchen, but in an older and finer system. The grain, the scruple, the dram, each one smaller and more exact than the last. Because the difference between a helpful dose of certain herbs and a dangerous one could be a matter of only a few grains. An apothecary's steady hand at these scales was not a small skill. It was, in the truest sense, the whole foundation of the trade. Every jar on every shelf bore some form of shorthand, most commonly a set of Latin abbreviations that any trained apothecary or physician could read at a glance, but that would have looked, to an untrained eye, like little more than a scatter of odd curling marks. These abbreviations told the reader not only what a jar contained, but often how it was meant to be prepared, or in what form it was kept, whether as a dried simple, a thickened syrup, or a compounded electuary. It was a private language, learned slowly over years of apprenticeship, and it kept a shop organized in a way that no ordinary household shelf could match. In most towns of any real size, an apothecary did not simply set up shop as he pleased. He belonged instead to a guild, a formal association of fellow apothecaries that set the standards of the trade, inspected shops for quality and honesty, and required years of supervised apprenticeship before a young man could be trusted to compound a remedy on his own. This oversight existed for good reason, for a badly measured dose of one of the stronger sleep herbs, sold by a careless or dishonest hand, could do real and lasting harm. The guild's seal on a shop door was, in its own quiet way, an early promise of safety. Among the most common preparations sold across that worn wooden counter was the electuary, a thick sweet paste made by grinding a dried herb or root into fine powder and working it into honey or a thickened syrup until it reached the consistency of a soft jam. Bitter or unpleasant herbs became, in this form, far easier to take, spooned directly from the jar or spread thinly on a piece of bread. A sleep-inducing electuary, kept ready on the shelf through the colder months, when restless nights were most common, might combine a little valerian root, a little poppy syrup, and enough honey to make the whole mixture almost pleasant to the taste. The jars themselves, called gallipots by those who kept them, were often small works of craft in their own right, glazed in blue or green or a warm earthy brown, sometimes decorated with a simple painted flower or the apothecary's own mark worked into the glaze before firing. A gallipot was meant to be reused for years, even decades, its surface built up over time with the faint residue of everything it had ever held, and a well-kept shop took real pride in the tidy uniform rows its gallipots made along the shelf, each one turned so its painted label faced outward toward the room. Behind the counter, more often than not, stood a boy of perhaps 12 or 13 years old, an apprentice bound to the apothecary for a term that could run 7 years or longer, his days spent grinding, measuring, sweeping, and slowly, patiently, learning to read the shorthand on the jars above his head. It was a long apprenticeship by any standard, longer than most other trades of the period required. And it reflected something the whole town seemed to understand without needing to say it aloud, that the difference between a helpful remedy and a harmful one very often came down to nothing more than careful, well-trained hands. It is from behind this same worn counter, reaching up to the highest and least often disturbed shelf, that the apothecary now lifts down a small object wrapped in a square of linen, carried carefully to a low table near the single candle burning in the shop. Unwrapped, it proves to be nothing more than an ordinary sea sponge, palm-sized, pale, faintly stiff to the touch. And yet this humble object, kept apart from every other preparation in the shop, held a reputation far larger than its size would suggest. It was called, in the Latin still used among physicians and surgeons of the age, the spongia somnifera, the sleeping sponge, and its origins reached back to one of the great medical schools of southern Italy, where surgeons faced with an operation too painful to perform on a fully waking patient had begun, centuries earlier, searching for some gentler alternative to simply holding a person still by force. What they arrived at, recorded carefully in surgical manuscripts copied and recopied by hand across the following centuries, was this sponge. Into its preparation went a careful mixture of the garden's strongest plants, generally including the milky juice of the poppy, a portion of ground mandrake root, the leaves of henbane, a little hemlock, and often the juice of mulberry ivy and the cooling garden lettuce. We have already met once and will meet again before the night is through. This mixture was boiled together in a small pot until it thickened, and the sponge itself was soaked in it thoroughly, again and again, until every fiber had drawn up as much of the mixture as it could hold. Once fully soaked, the sponge was set out to dry completely in open sunlight, and in its dried state it could be kept safely on a shelf for months, even years, its potency held quietly in reserve until the moment it was needed. This was one of the sponge's great advantages over a fresh preparation. A surgeon traveling between towns, or a household some distance from the nearest apothecary, could keep a dried sleeping sponge ready and waiting, requiring nothing more than a little warm water to bring it back to life when the moment finally came. When that moment arrived, the dried sponge was dipped briefly in hot water, just long enough to soften and release its gathered virtue, and was then held close beneath the patient's nose, who was instructed to breathe in slowly and steadily through the resulting vapor. There was no cutting, no swallowing, no bitter taste to force down, only breath drawn in again and again until the patient's eyes grew heavy, their limbs loosened, and a deep and merciful unconsciousness settled over them, long enough, if all went well, for the surgeon's work to be finished. Bringing a patient back afterward required its own careful method, for a sleep this deep did not simply lift on its own in a convenient moment. A second sponge, this one soaked instead in vinegar, mixed with a little salt or crushed fennel, was held to the nostrils, its sharp bracing scent enough, in most cases, to draw a sleeper back up out of the depths and into a slow, blinking waking. It was a delicate balance from beginning to end, and every physician who kept a sleeping sponge on his shelf understood, with real seriousness, how much trust that small pale object was being asked to hold. The sleeping sponge was not the only answer medieval surgery found to the problem of pain, and on a lower shelf of the same shop, kept in a small stoppered flask, rather than wrapped in linen, waited a very different sort of remedy. This was dwale, a drink rather than a vapor, and its name alone, an old word meaning something close to stupor or a deep bewildering sleep, was enough to tell a patient exactly what they were about to receive. The word itself had traveled a long road to reach that shelf, drifting down through older forms of English and French, always carrying roughly the same meaning: a heavy, unnatural sleep brought on by artificial means. By the time it appears written down in the surviving medical collections of the later medieval period, it had already become the standard term for this particular family of surgical sleep draughts, understood by physician and patient alike without any further explanation needed. One such recipe, preserved in a 15th century collection of medical remedies, copied out by hand for the use of a working physician, lists its ingredients with a plainness that still feels startling to read. Bile taken from a boar or a swine, the pressed juice of hemlock, the root of bryony, a climbing hedge plant with its own considerable strength, the juice of wild lettuce, a measure of opium, drawn from the same poppy already familiar to us from the garden, vinegar to sharpen and preserve the whole mixture, and wine to carry it, to soften its bitterness, and to help it settle more easily in a frightened patient's stomach. These ingredients were combined and left to stand together for a period, the exact timing varying from one written recipe to the next, until the physician judged the mixture ready. Judging correctness was, admittedly, an inexact art by any modern standard, resting on years of accumulated experience rather than any measured concentration, and a physician preparing dwale relied heavily on what he had seen the mixture do in patients before, adjusting the proportions of boar bile or hemlock juice according to memory and instinct as much as any written formula. When the moment for surgery arrived, the patient was given the draught to drink, usually in a small cup, sometimes sweetened slightly with honey to make the bitter taste more bearable. Unlike the sleeping sponge, which worked through breath and could be withdrawn the moment enough had been taken in, a swallowed dwale committed the physician and patient both to whatever dose had already gone down. There was no calling the medicine back once it had been drunk, and this single fact shaped every careful word written about dwale in the surviving medical texts of the period. That caution was well founded, for the line between a dose deep enough to allow surgery and a dose deep enough to prevent a patient ever waking again was narrower than any physician of the age would have liked. Surviving manuscripts urge repeated testing, careful watching of the patient's breath and color, and a willingness to stop giving further doses the moment the desired heaviness set in. It was, by every honest account, a dangerous remedy, used only when the alternative, an unmedicated surgery on a fully conscious patient, was judged even worse. Bringing a patient back from dwale's depths required its own patient effort, most commonly cold water dashed against the face, or a cloth soaked in vinegar held beneath the nose, echoing the same waking method used for the sleeping sponge. In the more difficult cases, physicians simply waited, sometimes for many hours, watching over a patient whose breath had slowed nearly to stillness, trusting that time and the body's own resilience would eventually do what no further remedy safely could. As the centuries passed and surgical knowledge slowly advanced, dwale fell gradually out of common use, its dangerous unpredictability giving way, in time, to gentler and more measured approaches. But its name lingered in folk memory long after the recipe itself had been largely forgotten, a quiet reminder, tucked into old glossaries and half-remembered sayings, of just how far the old world was willing to go in its long search for a mercy against pain. At the heart of nearly every remedy we have gathered so far, from the sponge to the draught to the simple syrup, on the still room shelf, sits one plant more than any other, and it deserves, before the night carries us any further, a fuller telling of its own. We have met the poppy already, standing quietly among the cabbages in the Physic garden. But there is a great deal more to say about the plant that medieval writers sometimes called, with a mixture of gratitude and unease, the flower of forgetting. The true medicine of the poppy lay not in its petals, but in the swelling seed head left behind once those petals had fallen. And the method of drawing that medicine out was a slow, patient, almost ritual act. A shallow cut, made with a small blade across the still green and unripe pod, allowed a thin milky sap to seep out and slowly darken in the open air. Left overnight, this sap thickened into a sticky, dark resin that could be scraped away the following morning, gathered drop by careful drop until enough had accumulated to be of any real use. This resin, opium in the language later centuries would settle on, carried a reputation stretching back long before the medieval period began, inherited from older civilizations that had already called the poppy a plant of joy, a gift capable of easing pain and inviting sleep in equal measure. Medieval physicians, drawing on translated texts from these earlier traditions, inherited that reputation largely intact, and the poppy's resin found its way into an enormous range of remedies, from the sponges and draughts we have already discussed to far gentler household preparations, meant for far gentler complaints. Among the most common of these gentler preparations was a thick sweet syrup known by its Latin name, diacodion, made by simmering poppy heads slowly in water until their virtue had passed fully into the liquid, then thickening that liquid with honey or sugar until it reached a consistency easy to spoon and swallow. A small dose of diacodion, kept ready in the still room through the colder months, was offered to anyone whose cough kept them from resting, or whose mind simply would not settle enough to allow sleep to arrive on its own. It was also, troublingly to a modern reader, sometimes given in weaker preparations to fretful infants and young children, a practice recorded in more than one household manual under the gentle heading of quietness, meant to soothe a crying child through a long night. Later generations of physicians, coming to understand far better than their medieval predecessors just how easily such a remedy could tip from helpful to harmful in the smallest of bodies, grew increasingly cautious about this particular use, and warnings against giving poppy preparations too freely to the very young appear more and more often in the later medical writing of the period. Even at the time, the more careful herbals never described the poppy as a remedy without risk. Writers reached again and again for the image of a double-edged tool, something capable of the deepest mercy in a skilled and careful hand and real harm in a careless one, and they urged their readers, in language that has survived remarkably well across the centuries, to measure with patience and to never assume that more of a good remedy could only do more good. The poppy's image traveled well beyond the pages of medical texts, appearing again and again in the margins and illuminations of manuscripts that had nothing directly to do with medicine, its nodding, drooping head a visual shorthand for sleep, and for a certain gentle forgetting that scribes and artists of the period seemed to find endlessly worth returning to. A reader flipping through an illuminated herbal, or even a book of hours meant for private prayer, might come across the poppy's unmistakable shape tucked quietly into a decorated border, its meaning understood at a glance by anyone who had grown up around a Physic garden. It is worth saying plainly, before we leave the poppy behind for tonight, that not every part of this plant carried the same weight of caution. The small dry seeds scattered across bread and pastry in kitchens across the medieval world held almost none of the strength found in the sap of the growing pod, and cooks who used them freely in their baking were doing something entirely different from the careful, deliberate work of the apothecary, drawing resin from an unripe seed head. It is a distinction worth holding on to as we walk on now, deeper into the garden's darker corner, toward the plant that even the poppy's own considerable reputation could not quite overshadow. Let us step back out now into the cool evening air, away from the shop's crowded shelves, and return for a moment to the walled garden where our night began, to the low-fenced corner we passed by quickly the first time, eyes lowered, basket still half empty. It is fully dark now, and it is only in this deeper darkness that the full story of what grows there can properly be told. Up close, the plant is almost disappointing in its ordinariness, its broad wrinkled leaves spreading low and wide across the ground in a loose rosette, not unlike a large coarse lettuce or cabbage. It is only beneath the soil that Mandrake becomes remarkable, its single thick root often growing forked into 2 or more branches, so that a root pulled whole from damp earth could, with only a little imagination and the flickering light of a lantern, take on the unmistakable outline of a small human figure, limbs and all. It was this uncanny resemblance, more than any medicinal property, that gave Mandrake its enormous and lasting reputation across the medieval world, and it gave rise to one of the strangest harvesting customs recorded from the entire period. Popular belief held that the root, when finally pulled free from the ground, let out a scream so terrible that any person who heard it directly would be struck deaf, or driven mad, or in the more dramatic tellings, killed outright by the sound alone. To avoid this fate, herbalists were said to follow an elaborate ritual before ever touching the plant with their bare hands. A circle was traced in chalk or drawn with an iron blade around the base of the plant, walked 3 times in careful silence. The digger's ears were stopped tightly with wax or wool, or in some accounts a horn was blown loudly nearby to drown out whatever sound the root might make, and rather than pulling the root by hand, a cord was tied around its base and fastened to the collar of a dog, who was then driven forward from a safe distance, left to take the fatal scream in the digger's place, while its human companion stood well back, ears still covered, waiting for the silence that meant it was finally safe to approach. Whether this ritual was ever truly practiced with the seriousness the old stories suggest, or whether it survived chiefly as a colorful tale traded between herbalists and their curious apprentices, the story itself appears again and again across surviving medieval writing, told with just enough conviction that it is difficult even now to say for certain where the caution ended and the folklore began. What is certain is that Mandrake was treated, by nearly everyone who wrote about it, as a plant deserving real respect, gathered only with deliberate care and never carelessly handled. Beneath all the drama of the harvest, Mandrake did carry genuine medicinal weight, and its root, steeped carefully in wine or worked into a preparation not unlike the draughts we have already discussed, served for centuries as a surgical sleep aid in its own right, sometimes used alongside poppy, and hemlock in the sponges and dwales already familiar to us, and sometimes prepared entirely on its own. A cup of mandrake wine, measured out with real caution by a physician who understood its strength, could bring on a heaviness of limb and mind deep enough to allow a painful procedure to pass almost unfelt. Beyond the surgeon's careful hand, Mandrake also carried a long and stubborn reputation in the world of folk magic that sat somewhat apart from its medicinal use altogether. Its human-shaped root was sometimes carved a little further to sharpen the resemblance. Dressed in a scrap of cloth and kept in a small box as a household charm, believed by some to bring good fortune, protection from harm, or in certain traditions, help toward a couple hoping for a child. A physician might roll his eyes at such uses, even while keeping his own carefully measured supply of the same root on his shelf for entirely different purposes. It would be wrong, though, to let the folklore obscure how genuinely dangerous mandrake could be in unskilled or careless hands. Taken in too great a quantity, it brought on a racing heart, a mouth gone suddenly and completely dry, strange shifting visions that some who survived a mistaken dose described in vivid and unsettling detail, and in the worst cases, a sleep from which the person never woke at all. It sat, in the honest judgment of most medieval physicians, among the very strongest and least forgiving plants in the entire garden. That judgment appears plainly in the surviving medical writing of the period, where mandrake is discussed always alongside careful warnings about dosage, often compared directly to poppy and hemlock as one of the three great cold, sleep-bringing plants a physician needed to understand thoroughly before ever prescribing. Measurements are given in the smallest units the age possessed, and more than one text urges the reader, in language that still carries real weight across the centuries, to begin always with less than seems necessary, for more could always be added, while too much, once given, could never be taken back. As physicians of later centuries came to better understand the risks mandrake carried, and as gentler, more predictable herbs slowly proved themselves reliable enough for most ordinary complaints, mandrake's everyday medicinal use declined a great deal, retreating gradually into the more specialized hands of surgeons facing the most severe and painful procedures, and eventually fading almost entirely from common practice. Its folkloric reputation, though, proved far harder to uproot than the plant itself, and stories of its scream and its strange human shape were still being told, in one form or another, long after most households had stopped keeping it on hand at all. Let us leave the mandrake corner now, gate latched carefully behind us, and return to gentler ground, to two plants we met only briefly on our first pass through the garden, and that deserve, in fairness, a rather fuller telling. Valerian, growing tall and a little untidy along the garden wall, carried one of the strangest reputations of any herb in the Physic garden, for the very same scent that most people found faintly unpleasant. Something earthy and a little sharp drew cats to it with an almost helpless fascination. In more than one region it was known simply as cat's herb, or in older regional dialects by names that translated roughly to something like capon's tail, and a household cat discovering a fresh-cut bundle of the root would often roll against it, paw at it, and behave for a short while in a manner every household found endlessly entertaining to watch. Its reputation among physicians was rather more serious. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess, whose writings on plants and healing survive, among the most detailed of the entire medieval period, described Valerian's calming effect in terms that would still sound familiar to anyone who has ever been handed a cup of it before bed. Later herbalists across the following centuries continued to recommend it for much the same purpose. A gentle loosening of whatever tightness kept a tired mind circling instead of resting. In many households, a fresh bundle of valerian was hung not only in the still room to dry, but directly over a doorframe or beside a window, a custom that blended genuine herbal knowledge with an older, more superstitious hope that the hung bundle might also keep out whatever unseen troubles a restless night could bring. Whether it was the scent settling quietly into the room, or simply the comfort of the ritual itself, the practice persisted in one form or another across a great many generations. Hops, climbing their trellis back in the garden and hanging in loose green cones through late summer, owed their earliest medieval fame almost entirely to brewing rather than to sleep. It was in the great monastic breweries of the period, where monks produced all, not only for their own tables, but often for the surrounding town as well, that hops first proved their worth. Their natural bitterness keeping a brew from soaring on long storage in a way that older, unhopped recipes simply could not match. It took longer for the hop's second and quieter talent to be widely noticed and put to deliberate use, but slowly, across the households and infirmaries that grew and dried the plant, an old practical habit took shape, that of stuffing a small linen pillow with dried hops alone or combined with lavender, and resting one's head against it through the night. The gentle, slightly musty fragrance released by the warmth of a sleeping head was believed, and later ages would find real reason to agree, to ease a mind too restless to settle on its own. Monastic communities across many regions kept dedicated hop gardens alongside their orchards and their vegetable beds, entire yards given over to the trellised vines, tended with the same patient seasonal care as any other crop the community depended on. A monastery's hop yard fed both its brewery and, in time, its infirmary, one plant quietly serving two very different purposes for the same tired community. One further bitter root deserves a place here before we move on, a tall spiked plant with dark purple flowers called vervain, gathered across much of the medieval world and pressed into service for an enormous range of complaints, sleeplessness prominent among them. Old herbals speak of it in almost reverent terms, calling it a cure for troubles of the head in general, and it was often combined with valerian or hops in a single evening cup. Three bitter roots working together where one alone might not have been quite enough. Let us leave the garden's darker corners behind now and walk back inside, through the kitchen this time, where the last of the evening's fire still glows red beneath a bank of grey ash, and settle for a while beside the warmth to talk about a different kind of medicine altogether. One built not around a single powerful plant, but around an entire way of understanding the body itself. Medieval physicians, drawing heavily on older Greek and Arab medical traditions, passed down through centuries of careful translation, believed the human body was governed by four great fluids they called humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each one carrying its own particular qualities of heat or cold, wetness or dryness. Sleep, in this understanding, was fundamentally a cooling and moistening process, a gentle withdrawal of the body's natural heat inward, away from the surface, as digestion finished its work and the vital spirits settled quietly for the night. A physician trying to help a sleepless patient was not simply reaching for a pleasant-tasting herb. He was trying, quite deliberately, to nudge an entire internal balance back toward the cool and settled state he believed sleep required. It was this framework of cooling and settling that made lettuce, of all the humble vegetables growing in any kitchen garden, into a genuine article of medicine rather than a mere salad leaf. The idea was not new to the medieval world at all. Writers reaching back centuries earlier had already noted that lettuce, eaten in quantity at the evening meal, seemed reliably to bring on drowsiness, and one old story, repeated and embellished across generations of physicians, told of a Roman emperor so devoted to his evening dish of lettuce that his household came to depend on it as a nightly ritual nearly as fixed as the meal itself. Medieval physicians, inheriting this reputation through translated texts, folded lettuce comfortably into their own cooling, sleep-bringing remedies without a second thought. Garden lettuce, mild and pleasant, was not the only form the plant took in an apothecary's careful hands. A stronger, wilder cousin grew along hedgerows and waste ground across much of the medieval world, a tall, bitter plant whose stem, when broken, wept a thin, milky sap, not unlike the poppy's own, if considerably gentler in its strength. Herbalists gathered this sap much as they gathered opium, scoring the stem and collecting the dried residue, and the resulting preparation, sometimes called by a name that translates roughly to lettuce opium, offered a milder, safer alternative for households wary of the poppy's greater power. From either the mild garden plant or its wilder cousin, the simplest and most common preparation of all was lettuce water, made by boiling a generous handful of leaves in plain water until the liquid took on a faint greenish tinge, then straining it and letting it cool to a drinkable warmth. A cup of lettuce water, taken quietly at the bedside, once the household had gone still, asked nothing dramatic of the drinker and offered, in most tellings, nothing dramatic in return, only a gentle, steady drift toward sleep that gave the remedy its lasting reputation as the safest and gentlest option any Physic garden could offer. For a restlessness that plain lettuce water could not quite settle, herbalists were not above combining it with stronger allies already familiar to us from earlier in the night. A little poppy syrup stirred into a cup of lettuce water, or a pinch of dried valerian root added to the boiling pot, could deepen the effect considerably while still keeping the overall preparation gentler and safer than either poppy or valerian taken fully on its own. It was, in its way, an early and instinctive understanding of a principle every apothecary came to trust, that several mild remedies working together could often achieve what one strong remedy risked doing badly. Beyond any single herb, medieval physicians paid close and careful attention to the timing and content of the evening meal itself, understanding correctly, even without the language a later age would use to describe it, that a heavy supper worked directly against a peaceful night. Written household guides of the period urge a light collation in the hours before bed rather than a full meal, favoring easily digested foods over rich meats or strongly spiced dishes, and warning specifically against retiring to bed on a full and laboring stomach. A restless night, in this understanding, often began not with any failure of the mind, but with a stomach still hard at work when the body was meant to be settling toward rest. This same logic of cooling and warming, so central to lettuce's reputation, shaped the entire layout of the Physic garden we walked through earlier in the night. Its beds divided not by mere convenience, but by the deliberate belief that cooling herbs and warming herbs served entirely different purposes and needed to be understood and used quite differently depending on what a particular patient's body seemed to require. A physician treating what he judged a hot, agitated sleeplessness reached instinctively for the garden's cooling bed, lettuce and chamomile, and the pale violet growing in its shaded corner, while a colder, more sluggish complaint called instead for the garden's warmer, more stimulating herbs entirely. Violet itself deserves a brief mention here. Its small, dark purple flowers gathered in early spring and worked, much like the poppy, into a thick, sweetened syrup kept ready on the still room shelf through the colder months, cooling and gently calming in the same tradition as lettuce. A spoonful of violet syrup stirred into warm water offered another soft option for a household with a fretful child or a mind too busy to settle. One more small, quiet tool among the many the old world kept close at hand for exactly this purpose. There is one more cup to speak of before we leave the kitchen fire behind, and it is perhaps the warmest and most companionable of everything the medieval night offered a tired body, a drink called a posset, thick, spiced, and unmistakably a comfort rather than a mere medicine. To make one, milk was set over the fire until it neared boiling, then poured all at once into a waiting measure of ale or wine, curdling almost instantly into soft, warm curds floating in a pale, faintly sweet whey, sweetened with honey and finished with a scattering of spice. It was served hot, in a shared cup passed from hand to hand, and drunk slowly in the last quiet hour before the household finally climbed toward bed. The spices scattered across the top of a good posset were rarely chosen at random, and a household's means shaped the cup considerably. Nutmeg, grated fresh from a small hard seed, carried from far across the sea, gave a warm, rounded fragrance that even a modest household could usually afford in small amounts. Cinnamon, ground from dried bark that had traveled an equally long road, added its own familiar warmth. And for households wealthy enough to reach for it, a single thread or two of saffron, the costliest spice in the entire cabinet, and one we will meet more fully before this hour is through, could turn an ordinary posset a rich golden color and lend it a faint honeyed bitterness prized above almost anything else on the shelf. A grander cousin of the simple posset, reserved for feast nights and for households of real means, was a spiced wine called hypocras, made by steeping cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and a generous measure of sugar directly in warm red wine, then straining the whole mixture through a cone-shaped cloth bag known, in a nod to the physician whose name the drink itself carried, as a hypocras sleeve. What emerged from that slow straining was a clear, richly spiced wine, warming from the first sip, offered at the close of a long evening as both a pleasure and, in the medical thinking of the age, a genuine aid toward a settled and comfortable night. It is from this very drink, and from the woolen cap so many people wore to bed through the cold months, that a familiar word finds its unexpected medieval roots. A warm cup taken just before climbing beneath the blankets, paired with a soft cap pulled snugly down over the ears, gave the whole small bedtime ritual a name, that has long outlived the actual habits it once described, and anyone reaching tonight, in whatever century they happen to live in, for a final warming drink before sleep is, in a small and rather charming way, still following a custom the medieval world would recognize at once. Not every household could offer wine or spiced sugar, and a simpler version of the same comfort reached even the poorest kitchen in the form of warm milk, sweetened with a little honey, if any could be spared, given especially to children whose fretfulness at bedtime was, in this small way at least, no different in the medieval world than in any other. A mother warming milk over a low fire, murmuring softly to a restless child while it cooled enough to drink, was practicing, without ever thinking of it in such terms, one of the oldest and gentlest remedies this entire night has to offer. And in the households and inns that stood somewhere between the grandest feast table and the poorest kitchen, offering a guest a warm posset before they retired for the night was simply good manners, a small quiet gesture of hospitality that said, as plainly as any words could, that the household wished its visitor a settled and comfortable rest. A traveler arriving cold and tired after a long day on the road might find, waiting at the bedside, exactly this small warm cup, and little else the age could offer would have felt, in that particular moment, quite so welcome. There is one small, sweet habit we have not yet mentioned tonight, tucked in at the very close of an evening meal. That deserves a brief place here, before we let the whole household finally drift off towards sleep. Once supper had been cleared away, a household with any means at all often passed around a small dish of comfits, aniseed, fennel seed, or caraway coated in a thin hardened shell of sugar, offered as a final sweet mouthful meant to settle a full stomach and freshen the breath before the evening's remaining hours began. Chewed slowly, one or two at a time, these small seeds carried a real practical purpose behind their pleasant taste, easing the same heavy, laboring digestion that physicians of the period warned so consistently against carrying to bed. Fennel and anise both belonged to the same gently warming family of seeds. We met once already among the still room's ordinary stock, and a physician recommending a few comfits after supper was, in effect, offering the very same digestive comfort as a proper steeped tea, only wrapped now in a form pleasant and portable enough to be passed casually around a table rather than measured out and steeped over a fire. Poor households, unable to afford the sugar such comfits required, reached instead for the plain seeds themselves, chewed directly and without any sweetening at all, the same fennel or caraway grown easily in even the smallest kitchen garden, offering much the same digestive comfort in a considerably humbler and more accessible form. It is a small, easily overlooked habit to close on, one seed at a time passed quietly around a table, already growing dim in the evening light, and yet it belongs, in its own modest way, to exactly the same broad and patient tradition every other remedy this long night has shown us, a household doing what small careful thing it could, with whatever means it happened to have, to help its own tired members find their way a little more easily toward rest. There are a handful of herbs we have walked past too quickly tonight, brushing against them only in passing on our way toward louder and more dramatic remedies, and before this long evening finally draws to its close, they deserve a proper moment of their own, gathered here together in one last quiet pause before we return, for good, to the bedside. rosemary. Its narrow evergreen leaves, holding their sharp, clean fragrance through every season of the year, carried a reputation stretching back centuries and touching nearly every corner of household life, valued not chiefly as a sleep herb in its own right, but as a guardian of clear thought and steady memory, and a small sprig tucked beneath a pillow was trusted by more than one old household guide to keep troubling thoughts from crowding a sleeper's mind and to grant instead a clearer, calmer rest. Students preparing for an examination and scholars facing an important piece of writing were said to favor rosemary above almost any other herb for exactly this reason, wearing a small sprig or burning a pinch of the dried leaf while they worked. And the same reputation for steadying and clarifying the mind carried naturally into the evening hours, when a household hoped for exactly the same clear, undisturbed rest it wanted for its waking thoughts. Sage, its soft grey-green leaves gathered and dried alongside rosemary in nearly every kitchen garden of the period, carried its own broad and trusted reputation, valued for soothing an unsettled stomach, easing a sore throat, and taken as a mild evening tea, calming the kind of low-grade agitation that so often stood between a tired body and an easy night's rest. Its very name, drawn from an old word meaning to heal or to save, tells its own story of just how highly this one plain garden herb was regarded across the whole medieval world. Borage, its bright blue star-shaped flowers scattered cheerfully through a garden bed each summer, carried a gentler and more particular reputation still, trusted especially to gladden a heavy or a sorrowful heart, and old herbals speak of it almost affectionately, claiming that the plant itself seemed to carry courage and good cheer within its simple flowers. A cup of borage flower tea, offered to someone whose sleeplessness seemed to spring from grief or worry rather than any bodily complaint, was meant to lift the spirit gently enough that rest might follow naturally behind it. Angelica, tall and sturdy with its broad umbrella-shaped clusters of small white flowers, carried perhaps the most dramatic reputation of this whole gentler company, credited across a great many regions with genuine protective power against illness and evil influence alike, its thick aromatic root dug, dried, and kept close by households anxious about whatever unseen dangers a long dark winter might bring. Its name itself, drawn from the same word that gives us angel, reflects just how highly its protective power was once regarded, a plant considered, quite literally, heaven-sent. A small sachet combining several of these gentler herbs together, rosemary for clarity, lavender for calm, a little dried rose petal for its simple sweetness, was a common enough household craft, sewn from a scrap of linen and tucked beneath a pillow or hung close by the bed. Its combined fragrance working quietly through the night in exactly the same patient, undramatic way that so much of tonight's medicine has already shown us. Before ever climbing into that waiting bed, a household with the means to manage it, particularly in the warmer months, when the effort felt less of a burden, might first pass through a proper warm bath, heated carefully over the kitchen fire and carried by the bucketful to a waiting wooden tub, believed by physicians of the age to loosen the body's tension and open its pores just enough to ease the transition into a settled, restful sleep. Public bathhouses, found in nearly every town of any real size, offered this same warm comfort to households without their own private means of heating enough water, and for a modest fee a tired traveller or a hard-working laborer could soak away the accumulated grime and tension of a long day before returning home for whatever evening remedy awaited them there. In later centuries, these public houses would fall under a rather harsher reputation than they had originally carried, and their popularity declined considerably as a result. But for much of the medieval period they served, quite simply and quite respectably, as one more ordinary tool in the whole broad household effort toward a genuinely restful night. And so, with these last few quiet herbs finally gathered in alongside everything else this evening has offered, and with the warm bath's gentle steam still lingering faintly in memory, we are ready at last to return, for the final time tonight, to the one place every single thread of this long story has always been leading us back toward: the bed itself, waiting patient and warm in the dark, exactly as it has been waiting all along. The fire has burned low now, and the household around us has begun, one member at a time, to drift toward the room where the night will actually be spent. Let us follow them there, up a narrow creaking stair, or through a low doorway hung with a woolen curtain, into the room that held, in the end, the true center of everything we have gathered so far, the bed itself. A bed of any real substance in the medieval world was first and foremost a considerable piece of carpentry, built from stout oak or elm, and joined with the same careful joinery a chest or a table might receive, for it was expected, in a household that could afford one at all, to last not just a lifetime, but often several. The grandest of these standing beds rose on 4 thick corner posts tall enough to support a full canopy overhead, while the more modest households of a village made do with a simpler trestle frame, its wooden legs slotted into a rectangular base that could, in a small, crowded cottage, be taken apart and stacked against the wall by day to free the floor for other work. Either way, the bed frame itself was rarely bought new by any but the wealthiest families. It was inherited, repaired, and passed down, a piece of furniture that quite literally carried a household's history within its joints. Whatever the frame, the actual sleeping surface built upon it was a matter of careful, layered construction, and a household's relative comfort at night could be read almost precisely in what filled its mattress ticking. At the very bottom of even a modest bed lay a thick layer of straw, packed into a loosely woven linen or hemp casing and refreshed at least once a year, usually at harvest time when fresh straw was easiest to come by. Above that, where a household's means allowed it, came a second layer of carded wool, softer and warmer than straw alone, and above that again, in only the wealthiest homes, a top layer of goose or duck feathers, gathered slowly over years and prized as one of a household's most valuable possessions. The gap between a feather bed and a straw pallet was, in the plainest terms, one of the clearest and most visible markers of wealth a medieval household possessed, discussed openly in the wills and household inventories that survive from the period, where a feather bed is very often singled out by name and left deliberately to a favored child or grandchild, valued as highly as silver plate or a good milking cow. A servant or a poorer laborer, by contrast, slept most nights on straw alone, sometimes freshened with sweet-smelling herbs, tucked in among the stalks to keep the whole pallet from soaring, and turned and shaken out regularly to keep it from packing down into an uncomfortable, lumpy mass. Even a fine feather bed required real seasonal upkeep to stay comfortable and free of vermin, and the turning and airing of bedding was a task most households took seriously. Carried outside on a clear, dry day to be beaten, aired in the sun, and inspected carefully for the small unwelcome guests that any warm, well-used bed could otherwise attract. A household that neglected this work paid for its neglect in restless, itching nights, and more than one household guide of the period includes plain, practical advice on exactly how often such airing ought to be done. Before climbing into a bed on a genuinely cold night, a household with any means at all reached for a warming pan, a shallow, covered vessel of polished brass or copper fitted with a long wooden handle, into which a few glowing embers were carefully shoveled from the hearth, run briskly back and forth beneath the sheets just before bedtime. The warming pan took the worst of a winter chill off the linen, and the particular hiss and faint scorched smell of a well-used warming pan against cold sheets was, for a great many households, simply the sound and scent of a night finally beginning in earnest. Around the grandest of standing beds hung heavy curtains, drawn closed on all sides once the household had settled in for the night, creating in effect a small, warm, private room within the larger, colder chamber. These bed curtains, sometimes called a tester, when paired with a matching wooden canopy overhead, served a genuinely practical purpose, well beyond mere decoration, holding in the body's own warmth through a long cold night, keeping out draughts that crept steadily through poorly sealed windows and doors, and offering, in a household where several generations or several servants might share a single large room, at least a thin curtained measure of privacy, resting against the headboard or simply piled at the top of the mattress lay the bolster, a long, firm, cylindrical cushion stretching the full width of the bed, stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers depending on the household's means, and above it, smaller and softer, the individual pillows each sleeper drew close to their own head. It was on just such a pillow, tucked discreetly beneath the linen case, that a household might place a small bundle of dried hops or lavender, the sleep-bringing custom we spoke of earlier in the garden, close enough to the sleeper's face that its faint fragrance would still be working long after the candle had been snuffed. Before ever lying down, a great many people, regardless of wealth, pulled on a soft knitted or woven cap to cover the head through the night, a garment plain and practical rather than fashionable, worn simply to hold in warmth that would otherwise escape quickly through an uncovered head in a cold, poorly heated room. The nightcap, as it came to be called, was so thoroughly ordinary a part of going to bed that portraits and manuscript illustrations of the period show it worn without any comment at all, a small woolen detail so expected that no artist felt any need to explain it. Space itself was a genuine luxury in the medieval world, and sharing a bed, far from carrying any particular embarrassment, was simply the ordinary and expected way most people spent their nights. Servants in a large household frequently shared not only a room, but a single bed between 2 or 3 of them. Children slept together for warmth as a matter of course, and travelers arriving at a busy inn late in the evening might find themselves offered, quite openly, a shared bed with a stranger who had arrived only a little earlier, an arrangement that surviving travel accounts describe as unremarkable, sometimes even welcome, on a genuinely cold night. For the very youngest members of a household, sleep began not in a bed at all, but in a small wooden cradle, and infants were very often wrapped snugly in long strips of soft cloth, a practice called swaddling, that bound the arms and legs close against the body. Believed by physicians of the age to calm a fretful infant, keep the limbs from growing crooked, and hold in warmth a small body could not yet generate reliably on its own. Swaddling was so widespread across the medieval world that an unswaddled infant would, in most households, have been the genuine oddity rather than the norm. A cradle itself was usually built with gently curved rockers along its base, and a mother, an older sibling, or a nursemaid would set it rocking with a foot or a steady hand while singing, softly and often almost tunelessly, whatever simple, repeated words came to mind. Many of these cradle songs leaned on a single soothing nonsense, syllable repeated again and again, lullaby sung over and over in a low, unhurried voice, a sound that has survived, in fragments and later carols, long after the specific melodies themselves were lost to time. Once the candle or the simple rushlight was finally pinched out, true darkness in a medieval bedchamber was darkness in the fullest sense the word could hold, unbroken by any distant glow of a neighboring town or a street lamp beyond the window. Light itself, whether from beeswax candles affordable only to the wealthy or from the cheaper, smokier tallow candles and rush lights that lit most ordinary homes, was expensive enough in time and material that a household's whole evening schedule bent around conserving it, and going to bed not long after dark was, for most people, simply good sense rather than any particular virtue. There lingered, alongside this quite practical economy of light, an older and stranger belief concerning the moon itself, held widely enough to leave real traces in the language and medicine of the period. Sleeping with moonlight falling directly across the face was thought by some physicians to unsettle the mind, even to bring on a kind of madness, a belief preserved still in the very word lunacy, drawn from the Latin name for the moon. Households wary of this danger drew their bed curtains a little more firmly closed on especially bright, clear nights, less out of any need for warmth than out of a lingering caution about what that pale, watching light might do to a sleeping mind left uncovered beneath it. One last simple comfort deserves a place in this long telling before we finally let the night close around us for good, and it asks nothing of any garden or any shop at all, only the patient work of a spinner's wheel and a weaver's steady loom. Wool, sheared each spring from a household's own small flock, or bought in careful measure from a village market, was spun into thread, dyed if the household's means allowed it, and woven at last into the heavy blankets that lay, night after night, across every bed we have visited tonight, from the grandest curtained frame to the humblest straw pallet shared by an entire tired family. A good wool blanket, thick and closely woven, held in a body's own gathered warmth far more effectively than any fire could manage across a whole long winter night, and a household judged its own comfort, in the coldest months especially, almost as much by the weight and quality of its blankets as by the size or the softness of the bed those blankets finally covered. Quilting, layering a soft filling of wool or worn cloth between two woven sheets and stitching the whole arrangement through in careful, repeating patterns, produced a still warmer and more evenly comfortable covering, and the slow, patient needlework this required, often carried out by candlelight across many long winter evenings, was itself one more small, quiet task that filled, for more than one household, Exactly the kind of unhurried watching hour we spoke of earlier tonight. Linen, woven instead from the fibers of the flax plant, provided the cooler, smoother sheet laid directly against the sleeper's own skin. Its natural fibers drawing dampness away from the body far more comfortably than wool ever could manage on its own. And a household's finest linen, bleached carefully pale and pressed smooth, was often reserved for guests or for the most special occasions, an ordinary household making do, most nights with a coarser and considerably less costly weave. There was real skill and real patience folded into every one of these plain, easily overlooked textiles. The shearing and the carding, the spinning and the dyeing, the long slow hours at the loom, and a sleeper settling beneath a heavy wool blanket on a cold winter night was resting. Whether they ever thought of it in quite these terms or not, beneath the accumulated labor of an entire household's quiet year-long work, every bit as deliberate and every bit as carefully made as any syrup or any sponge we have gathered together this evening. And so, wrapped now in wool and linen both, warmed by a posset already drunk, calmed by whatever herb the evening called for, and watched over by whatever small charm or quiet prayer a household trusted most, the sleeper we have followed through this whole long night is, at last, entirely ready for rest. Every single thread this evening has offered finally gathered close around them in the dark. There is one small corner of the household we have not yet lingered in tonight, tucked close beside the main sleeping chamber, or sometimes within it, where the very smallest and most easily unsettled member of the family lay, and the whole art of coaxing sleep found there its gentlest and most patient expression of all. A midwife's responsibilities in the medieval world extended well beyond the birth itself, and a great many of the small nursery customs a household relied upon in the weeks and months that followed had passed through her hands, and her accumulated experience long before they ever reached a young or uncertain mother, learning the work for the first time. It was very often the midwife who first showed a household exactly how tightly to swaddle an infant, which herb to favor for a colicky evening, and how to judge, by nothing more than long-practiced instinct, whether a fretful child's crying signaled real trouble, or simply the ordinary discomfort every infant carried through its earliest months. For an unsettled stomach keeping an infant from settling, households turned to a thin, gently warmed gruel known as a caudle, made from a base of oats or fine flour thinned with milk or ile and sweetened lightly with honey, offered not as a full meal, but as a soft, easily digested comfort, meant to quiet a complaining belly enough to let sleep finally take hold. Caudles served the sick, and the newly delivered mother as well as the infant, one more small warm preparation drawn from the very same broad tradition of gentle, undemanding nourishment that shaped so much of this night's medicine. Teething brought its own particular unrest to a great many households, and a fretful infant working a new tooth through tender gums kept more than one medieval household awake through long, difficult nights. Herbalists offered what comfort they could, a little chamomile rubbed gently against the gum, or a small soft cloth dipped in a mild honeyed water for the child to chew against. Remedies offering modest relief rather than any real cure, but valued all the same by exhausted parents grateful for whatever small mercy the night could offer. The cradle itself, standing close beside the parent's own bed, or sometimes tucked into its own small alcove, was built with a particular attention to its rocking motion, its curved wooden rockers shaped and weighted with real care, for a household understood well, through nothing more than long-lived experience, that a steady, gentle rocking motion could settle a crying infant when almost nothing else would. A tired mother, one hand steady on the cradle's edge through half the night, kept that motion going long after her own eyes had begun to close. The songs sung over that rocking cradle carried, in their simplest and oldest surviving forms, remarkably little in the way of actual words at all, built instead around a single soft repeated sound, sung low and slow, over and over, syllable after syllable, until the sound itself became less a song in any formal sense than a kind of steady, breathing rhythm laid gently over the cradle's own rocking motion. Fragments of these old repeated sounds survive still in later carols and nursery rhymes, worn smooth by centuries of gentle repetition, long after whatever fuller verses once surrounded them had faded entirely from memory. Infants were watched, in the medieval understanding, with a particular protective anxiety that adults, hardened by their own years of survived nights, no longer quite carried for themselves. And it was for exactly this reason that so many of the small protective charms we spoke of earlier, the herbs, the tiny cradle bells, the whispered private blessings, clustered especially thickly around the youngest and most vulnerable sleepers in any household. A grown adult might shrug off an unsettling dream as nothing more than a passing trouble of the mind. A household watching over an infant's sleep took no such chances, however small or however old-fashioned we might now consider the precautions they took. And so, in this smallest and gentlest corner of the whole long night we have walked through together, every single thread we have gathered along the way finally draws together at once. A herb from the garden, a warmed drink from the kitchen fire, a charm hung close for protection, a low, steady song, and above everything else, a patient, watchful presence sitting close beside the bed until sleep, in its own good and unhurried time, finally arrives. The candle by the bed has been snuffed now, and the last member of the household has finally climbed beneath the blankets. And here we arrive at something that belonged to no single herb or drink at all, something that lived instead in the very shape of the night itself, a habit of sleeping so ordinary across the medieval world that almost nobody thought to write it down as anything unusual, and so ordinary that it has, in the centuries since, been almost entirely forgotten. In most households of the period, once the fire had been banked and the last chores finished, people simply went to bed not long after darkness fell, often within an hour or two of dusk, for there was little reason and less cheap light to keep them upright any longer. This first stretch of sleep, unbroken and usually deep, was known plainly in the letters, diaries, and medical writing that survive from the period as the first sleep, a term used with no more ceremony than we might use for breakfast or supper. What made this first sleep different from the long unbroken night most people expect today was what came after it. Somewhere in the deep, quiet hours, often close to midnight, a great many sleepers simply woke, not from any noise or worry, but as naturally and unremarkably as a person might wake at dawn. This waking was neither feared nor fought against. It was, by every surviving account, simply expected, a normal hinge in the middle of an ordinary night's rest. The hour that followed this natural waking was known, in the plain language of the period, as the watch, or sometimes simply as the watching, and it might last anywhere from a half hour to a full hour or more before sleep returned on its own. Far from being treated as a problem to be solved, this waking hour was folded comfortably into the rhythm of an ordinary night, a quiet stretch of wakefulness that a household simply lived through, candle relit or not, before settling back down again. Physicians of the period, when they mentioned the watch at all, generally did so with the same calm, matter-of-fact tone they used for any other ordinary bodily process, treating it as a healthy and expected pause, rather than any kind of disorder. Some connected it directly to digestion, believing the body used this middle hour to finish quietly processing the evening's meal before settling into the deeper, more restorative sleep that would carry a person through to morning. A wakeful hour in the night was not, in this understanding, a failure of rest at all, but simply one more stage within it. What a household actually did during the watch varied enormously, and surviving accounts describe a wide and gentle range of activities, none of them urgent, none of them demanding. Many people simply lay quietly where they were, letting their thoughts wander without any particular direction, a kind of loose, unhurried reflection that some later writers would come to see as genuinely valuable in its own right, offering a stretch of private thought a busy daylight rarely allowed for. For others, the watch was a time for quiet prayer, a chance to review the day just finished and to ask, in the private dark, for whatever guidance or forgiveness the day's actions seemed to call for. Devotional writings from the period sometimes recommend exactly this practice, treating the middle of the night as an especially suitable hour for honest, unhurried self-examination, free from the small distractions and social pressures that filled the daylight hours. In households where a fire could be safely coaxed back to a low glow, the watch became, for some, a small window of quiet, productive work, a little mending taken up by firelight, a spindle turned steadily between practiced fingers, tasks simple and repetitive enough to be done half in the dark by feel alone. It was slow, unhurried work, suited exactly to a mind not yet fully returned from sleep, and it let a household use even its wakeful hours towards some small, useful end. For a husband and wife lying together in the dark, the watch was also, by more than one surviving account, simply a time for quiet conversation, low-voiced and unhurried, the kind of talk that a full, busy day rarely left room for. Plans for the coming day, small domestic concerns, or simply companionable quiet murmuring passed the hour gently. Two people awake together in the dark, while the rest of the household, and much of the surrounding world, slept on undisturbed around them. Scholars and the more studious members of a household sometimes prized the watch above almost any other hour of the day for a different reason entirely, valuing its particular stillness for reading or quiet study. A single candle relit beside a psalter or a treasured book, the household, otherwise dark and silent around it, offered a kind of concentrated, undisturbed attention that the noise and business of daylight simply could not match. And more than one writer of the period speaks warmly of the watch as their favorite hour for careful, patient thought. It was also, for a great many people, a natural hour for remembering and telling over the dreams that had come during the first sleep, turning them over aloud or in private thought, wondering, sometimes with real seriousness, what meaning might be hidden inside them. This habit of dream-telling during the watch fed directly into a whole separate tradition of dream interpretation that we will turn to properly in just a moment, once the watch itself has run its course. Eventually, without any particular signal or effort, drowsiness would return, settling back over the household as gently as it had lifted, and people simply lay back down and drifted once more into what was called, with the same plain honesty as before, the second sleep. This second stretch of rest, carrying a sleeper through to the grey beginnings of dawn, was often described in the surviving writing of the period as the deeper and more restorative of the two, the sleep in which the most vivid and memorable dreams were most likely to occur. What is perhaps most striking about this whole two-part rhythm, reading through the letters and household accounts that mention it, is how utterly unremarkable it seemed to the people living it. Nobody complained of insomnia for simply waking in the night. Nobody reached for a remedy to force an unbroken sleep through until morning. The night, in the medieval understanding, was not expected to pass in one single unbroken stretch at all, and a person lying awake in the deep, quiet hours, listening to the small sounds of a sleeping household around them, was doing nothing more unusual than any other ordinary night required. There is a real comfort, perhaps, in carrying that small piece of old knowledge into whatever hour you happen to be listening in tonight. If you should find yourself briefly awake in the coming hours, eyes open in the dark for no particular reason at all, you are not failing at anything. You are simply keeping, in your own quiet way, an old and thoroughly ordinary watch and sleep, as it always did for the households of that older world, will find its way back to you again in its own good time. Before we walk on any further into the night, it is worth pausing here, in the quiet of the sleeping household, to consider the broader rules physicians of the age laid down not for any single remedy, but for the whole art of resting well. Rules that reached from the moment of lying down to the moment of rising again. Chief among the surviving guides to this everyday wisdom was a long rhymed poem known as the Regimen of Salerno, composed and added to over generations by the physicians of the great medical school in southern Italy, and copied, translated, and passed hand to hand across the whole of Europe until its simple, memorable verses had become almost proverbial. It covered diet, exercise, temperament, and the care of the whole body, and among its many practical instructions, a good number were given over entirely to the proper management of sleep. The poem and the physicians who echoed its advice were remarkably specific about the position a sleeper ought to take through the night. The recommended practice was to begin lying on the right side, believed to allow the stomach to settle comfortably beneath the liver and aid the ongoing work of digestion, before turning later to the left side for the remainder of the night. Lying flat on the back was generally discouraged, believed to invite heavy, troubled dreams, and lying face down was avoided almost universally, thought to press uncomfortably on the very organs sleep was meant to allow rest. How long a person ought to sleep was not treated as a fixed number applying equally to everyone, but as something that shifted reasonably with age, season, and constitution. Children and the elderly were generally advised toward longer rest than a healthy adult in the prime of life, and winter's long dark nights were considered a natural invitation to sleep somewhat longer than the short bright nights of summer allowed or required. A physician advising a patient on sleep was expected to weigh all of this together, rather than reaching for any single universal rule. Eating a heavy meal and then retiring immediately to bed was warned against with real consistency across the surviving medical writing of the period, echoing the same caution about digestion and heavy suppers we touched on earlier beside the kitchen fire. A short walk, even a brief turn about the garden or the hall, was commonly recommended between the evening meal and the moment of finally climbing beneath the blankets, giving the stomach a head start on its work before the whole body settled into the stillness of sleep. A great many household guides also recommended washing the feet in warm water shortly before bed, a simple practical habit believed to draw heat gently downward through the body and ease the transition into rest, not unlike the warming pan already familiar to us from the bedchamber itself. It was a small, unremarkable ritual, requiring nothing more than a basin and a little heated water, and it appears often enough in the surviving household writing of the period to suggest it was genuinely common practice rather than a rare or unusual habit. The air of the sleeping chamber itself received its own careful attention, for physicians of the age held firmly to the belief that bad or stagnant air, sometimes described in terms very close to a kind of poisonous vapor, could do real harm to a sleeper left breathing it all night long. Windows were opened during the day whenever weather allowed, to let the chamber air itself out thoroughly before nightfall, and a room that had stood shut and stale through a long wet spell was regarded with genuine, practical suspicion. Napping during the daylight hours drew a more mixed opinion from the physicians of the period, with a good many writers warning that it could steal away the depth and readiness of the coming night's sleep, leaving a person restless and poorly rested by morning, despite having slept twice in the same day. A brief rest in the hottest hours of a summer afternoon was more widely tolerated, even recommended in some warmer regions, but a long or habitual daytime sleep was generally treated as a fault to be corrected rather than a harmless indulgence. Astrological belief threaded through medieval medicine far more thoroughly than a modern reader might expect, and almanacs consulted by physicians and educated households alike marked out particular days and particular phases of the moon as more or less favorable for certain remedies, for bloodletting, and for the gathering of especially potent herbs. A sleep remedy prepared and administered under what an almanac judged a favorable sky was believed to work more surely than the very same remedy given carelessly on an unfavorable night, a belief that shaped, in ways easy to overlook now, exactly when a great many of the treatments we have already discussed tonight were actually put to use. Where a household's bed itself stood, and which direction it faced within the room, drew its own share of careful, half-superstitious attention. Advice survives in more than one period source cautioning against situating a bed directly beneath an open beam or facing a door too squarely, concerns that blended practical worries about draughts and disturbance with older, less clearly articulated beliefs about which directions and arrangements simply felt, to the households of the time, more restful than others. Quiet itself was recognized plainly, without any need for elaborate theory, as essential to good rest, and household guides advise keeping animals, small children, and any loud or disruptive activity well away from a sleeping chamber once the household had settled for the night. A barking dog, a crying infant in the wrong room, or servants moving noisily about their late chores were all understood as genuine threats to a good night's rest, worth managing deliberately rather than simply enduring. Physicians took real care, in their more serious writing, to distinguish an ordinary tiredness that a day's honest labor produced from the more troubling sleeplessness that could signal genuine illness, whether of the body or, in the language of the time, of the mind and spirit together. A patient who could not sleep despite every comfort and remedy already offered was, in this understanding, showing a sign worth investigating further, rather than simply a stubborn habit to be scolded out of them. Travelers, merchants, and pilgrims making their way along the long roads of the medieval world rarely carried a full Physic garden or a well-stocked apothecary shop with them, and surviving travel accounts describe a whole smaller, more portable tradition of remedies improvised from whatever an inn or a wayside village could offer. A handful of local herbs, steeped in borrowed water, or simply the shared posset already discussed, offered by a hospitable innkeeper to a road-weary guest. Access to a trained, university-educated physician remained, throughout the medieval period, a genuine privilege of wealth and status, and the great majority of ordinary households relied instead on a much older and more local tradition of care, most often passed down through the women of a village who had learned, over years of quiet practical experience, which herb suited which complaint. This local knowledge, rarely written down in its own time and easy for later ages to overlook entirely, in fact supplied the greater share of the remedies actually used across the medieval world night after night. Out of this whole accumulated body of careful, patient advice, gathered from physicians, household guides, and generations of quiet local practice alike, came the simple proverbs that have long outlived the detailed medical reasoning behind them. Plain sayings about early rising and early resting that still circulate today in something close to their original form, carrying, however worn and familiar they have become, a genuine echo of centuries spent thinking hard and carefully about exactly how a good night's rest was best achieved. There is one final figure we ought to meet before this long night finally lets us go, a physician roused from his own bed by an urgent knock at his door, called out into the dark streets we walked through earlier tonight, past the curfew bell's own quiet authority, toward a household somewhere across town where sleep had refused, for one troubled patient, to come at all. A physician answering such a summons carried with him a case built specifically for exactly this purpose, compact enough to be managed easily on foot or on horseback, holding within its fitted compartments small stoppered vials of his most trusted preparations, a portion of poppy syrup, a little dried valerian root, perhaps a small measure of the sleeping sponge mixture already familiar to us, along with the fine brass scales and tiny graduated weights needed to measure out whatever dose the night's particular troubles seemed to call for. Physicians answering a genuine nighttime emergency were among the few members of an ordinary town permitted to move about freely after the curfew bell had rung and the streets had otherwise emptied, a lantern held aloft in one hand and the case of remedies in the other, recognized on sight by any watchman encountered along the dark road and waved past without question or delay. The whole town's careful nighttime order-bending in this one respect, around the genuine urgency of illness. Arriving at last beside a restless or fevered patient, a physician worked by whatever light the household could offer, a single candle held close, or a small oil lamp set on a nearby stool. Examining a patient's pulse, the color and warmth of their skin, and asking careful questions about the day's meals and the particular character of their sleeplessness, weighing all of this together in the manner already familiar to us from the Physic garden's own careful division of cooling and warming beds, before finally deciding which of tonight's many remedies seemed best suited to this one particular case. Not every night call ended in any dramatic remedy at all, and a great many physicians, arriving to find a patient more anxious than genuinely ill, offered little more than calm reassurance, a gentle recommendation of a plain cup of chamomile or lettuce water, already familiar to any household, and a promise to return again in the morning should the trouble persist any further. It was, in its own quiet way, as much a part of the physician's real skill as any stronger remedy carried in his case, knowing precisely when the gentlest possible answer was also the correct one. For the household receiving such a visit, the simple fact of the physician's arrival, lantern swinging in the dark outside their window, case of careful remedies in hand, carried its own real comfort, quite apart from whatever remedy he finally offered, a visible sign that their trouble had been taken seriously enough to draw a trained hand out of a warm bed and through the cold, curfew silenced streets to reach them. And so, as that same physician finally makes his own quiet way back home again, lantern still lit against the dark, his emptied case a little lighter than it had been an hour before, we might let him stand, for these last closing minutes, as a fitting final image of everything this whole long night has tried to show, a whole world of careful, patient, unhurried attention given freely and without complaint to the simple and endlessly repeated task of helping another tired person finally find their rest. Let us step outside once more, just for a little while, out through the low door and into the narrow street beyond, where the whole town around us is settling, in its own larger and more public way, into exactly the same rhythm of rest we have been following indoors all this while. Somewhere above the rooftops, a bell begins to toll, unhurried. The same fixed number of strokes it has sounded every evening for as long as anyone in the town can remember, and every household within hearing of it understands at once, without needing to think twice, exactly what it means. This is the curfew bell, rung at a set hour after sundown, and it marks, as plainly as any spoken announcement could, the moment the whole town's public day has ended and its long private night has properly begun. The word itself, curfew, carries its meaning built directly into its own old roots, descending from a French phrase meaning simply cover the fire, and that plain, practical instruction was exactly what the bell was calling every household in the town to do. In a place built largely of timber and thatch, standing close together along narrow, crowded streets. An open hearth left carelessly burning through the night was a genuine and constant danger, capable of turning a single household's carelessness into a fire that could consume half the town before anyone woke to stop it. To answer that danger, households kept a simple, purpose-built tool close by the hearth, a shallow domed metal cover, often called by the very same name as the bell that summoned its use, designed to be set directly over the glowing coals once the evening's cooking and heating were finished. Raked into a low, contained heap and smothered beneath this cover, the fire would smoulder gently through the night, rather than blaze, kept alive enough to be coaxed back to life quickly the following morning, but safely banked against any real risk of spreading while the household slept. In the larger towns and cities of the period, the curfew bell carried a second, more official weight as well, for it very often marked the hour at which the town gates themselves were finally closed and barred for the night, and any traveller still on the road outside, when that bell sounded, could expect to spend the night waiting in the dark, beyond the walls rather than gain entry, until the gates reopened with the dawn. A merchant delayed on the road, hearing that distant bell toll, while still some way from the town he had hoped to reach, understood exactly what awaited him, and travellers of the period learned quickly to plan their days around exactly this deadline. Once the curfew bell had sounded and the streets had emptied of their ordinary daytime business, responsibility for the town's continued safety passed to a small, dedicated body of night watchmen. Men who walked fixed rounds through the dark streets, carrying a lantern in one hand and often a staff or a small horn in the other, charged with keeping an eye out for fire, for theft, and for any disturbance that might threaten a sleeping town. At set intervals through the night, a watchman making his rounds would call out the hour in a loud, clear, carrying voice, often followed by a short reassuring phrase telling the town, quite literally, that all remained well. For a sleeper briefly stirring during the very watch we spoke of a little earlier, that distant familiar call, drifting faintly through a shuttered window, could serve almost as its own small comfort, a reminder that someone, somewhere, remained awake and watching so that everyone else could rest without worry. Many towns also required, by simple ordinance, that any household still keeping a light burning after a certain hour hang a lantern visibly at its door or window, a small courtesy that let the watchman and any other householder abroad on legitimate business see clearly where light and activity still remained after most of the town had gone dark. A street lined here and there with these small hanging lanterns, set against the deep unbroken darkness of the surrounding houses, must have made for a striking sight to anyone still out walking after the curfew bell had rung. Not every household or trade was expected to observe the curfew with quite the same strictness. Inns keeping late travellers, certain workshops finishing urgent orders, and households tending a sick or labouring member were generally granted a reasonable measure of tolerance, provided their continued activity stayed within sensible limits and drew no particular complaint from watchful neighbours. The curfew, in practice, was rarely so rigid a rule as its solemn evening bell might suggest, bending sensibly around the genuine needs of a working town. Beyond its practical purpose in fire safety, the curfew served a second function that mattered just as much to the town's sense of order, discouraging the kind of theft, brawling, and general disorder that a busy, crowded town after dark could all too easily fall into. A street empty of all but the official watch was, by simple logic, a street far harder for any wrongdoer to move through unnoticed, and the curfew bell's nightly toll stood, in this sense, as much a quiet guardian of the town's peace as it was a caution against fire. For the ordinary household, hearing that bell roll out over the rooftops evening after evening, year after year. Its deeper meaning eventually settled into something simpler and more personal than any of its official purposes, becoming, in the end, little more than the town's own shared signal that the time for rest had properly arrived. Just as a monastery's own bells, which we will hear again shortly, called an entire religious community to the same rhythm at once, the curfew bell called an entire secular town to its rest together, one household after another banking its fire, latching its door, and settling down beneath the very same darkening sky. There was, in certain regions, a further custom attached to this hour, a short blessing or prayer said quietly over the covered hearth itself before the household finally turned toward bed, asking, in whatever words a particular family or region favored, that the banked fire be kept safely through the night, and that the sleeping household beneath its roof be kept safe alongside it. It was a small private echo, spoken over embers rather than over a bed, of the same wish for protected rest that carried through every other custom we have gathered so far tonight. And so, as the last lantern along the street is finally drawn indoors, and the watchman's distant call fades further into the dark, the whole town settles, more or less together, into the same long quiet we have been moving through all evening, one banked fire and one latched door after another, until the narrow streets themselves lie as still and as silent as the Physic garden we first stepped into so many hours ago. Back indoors now, and back upstairs, where the household we left sleeping has drifted, by this hour, fully into the deeper currents of the night. Let us speak for a while of what the medieval world believed happened once a sleeper had fully surrendered to their rest, and of the whole quiet tradition built up around understanding, and sometimes guarding against whatever came to them in the dark. Dreams were taken with real seriousness across the medieval world, treated neither as meaningless nor as something to be shrugged off with the morning light. And a whole minor literary tradition grew up around the patient work of interpreting them. Households that owned even a small handful of books were often more likely to own a dream book than almost any other kind of text besides a psalter or a prayer book, copied and recopied by hand until the same core list of dream meanings had spread, in one translated form or another, across the greater part of the continent. Chief among these was a text long attributed, rightly or not, to the prophet Daniel himself, whose own famous gift for reading dreams in the older biblical stories made his name a natural one to attach to a popular guide of this kind. Arranged usually as a simple list, it offered short plain entries running through dozens upon dozens of dream images: a snake, a burning house, a lost tooth, a river in flood, each paired with a brief explanation of what such a dream was thought to foretell for the person who had experienced it. A household consulting such a book after a particularly vivid or unsettling dream did not need to be especially learned to make use of it, for its simple alphabetical or thematic arrangement let even a modestly literate reader or a neighbor willing to read aloud on their behalf find the relevant entry quickly and without any special training. It was, in its own modest way, one of the most genuinely popular and widely consulted texts of the entire medieval period. However little attention it tends to receive today, the Church's own attitude toward this whole tradition remained, across the centuries, a little uneasy and never entirely settled. Some clergy tolerated dream books as harmless household curiosities, gently discouraged but not seriously condemned, while others, particularly the more strict-minded theologians of certain periods, warned rather more firmly against placing too much faith in them, wary of any practice that seemed to edge toward fortune-telling, or a kind of folk magic sitting uncomfortably close to superstition. Underlying this unease sat a genuine theological question the period took seriously: the distinction between an ordinary, meaningless dream produced by nothing more than a restless mind or a heavy supper, and a true, divinely sent dream carrying some real message worth heeding. Sorting one from the other was never treated as simple, and even sympathetic writers on the subject urged real caution, reminding their readers that most dreams, however vivid, were probably nothing more than the mind's own idle wandering, rather than any message worth acting upon. Not every dream, though, was merely unsettling in an abstract, symbolic way, and the medieval world had its own vivid and specific name for one particular kind of frightening night experience: a sudden crushing heaviness felt across the chest, accompanied often by a helpless inability to move or cry out, as though some unseen weight had settled directly onto the sleeper's body. This experience was attributed to a spirit or demon known simply as the Mare, and it is from this old, half-forgotten word that our own familiar term nightmare descends directly, carrying, buried inside its very spelling, the memory of a creature few people today would recognize by name. Accounts of an encounter with the Mare describe it in strikingly consistent terms across widely separated regions: the same crushing weight, the same paralysis, the same sense of a malicious presence pressing down in the darkness, close enough to feel but impossible to see clearly or push away. Whatever the true physical cause behind such experiences, and later ages would eventually offer their own, quite different explanation for this same familiar sensation, the medieval world understood it firmly as a genuine and specific danger of the night, worth guarding against with real deliberate care. Rue, a small bitter herb with feathery blue-green leaves, was among the most trusted defenses against exactly this kind of trouble. Hung in small dried bundles near the bed, or tucked directly beneath the pillow, believed to hold whatever restless spirit might otherwise trouble a sleeper, safely at bay through the night. Its sharp, distinctive scent, unmistakable even in a darkened room, was thought to be precisely what a malicious night spirit found unbearable. Vervain, already familiar to us from its place among the garden's bitter roots, carried this same protective reputation alongside its calming medicinal one, and old herbals describe it in near identical language to rue, a plant capable of guarding a sleeper's peace as surely as it guarded their waking health, blurring, in exactly the way so much of this night's knowledge does, any firm line between medicine and quiet protective charm. St. John's wort held perhaps the strongest reputation of all in this particular tradition, and it was gathered, wherever possible, on the specific summer feast day that gave the plant its name, a timing believed to concentrate its protective power at its very highest point in the whole year. Bundles gathered on this one particular day were hung over doorways and above beds throughout the following months, trusted above almost any other single plant to keep bad dreams and worse spirits equally at a distance. Beyond any single herb, households reached for smaller, more personal protections as well. a scrap of parchment inscribed with a short written prayer and tucked beneath a pillow, a small blessed cross worn on a cord around the neck, even through sleep, or a charm sewn quietly into the lining of a nightshirt, each one carrying the same simple hope that whatever watched over a sleeper through the dark hours would keep the Mare, and every lesser trouble besides, well away from the bed. Infants, believed especially vulnerable to night terrors of every kind, were sometimes given their own small protective charms fastened to the cradle itself. Tiny bells whose faint ringing at the slightest movement was thought both to soothe a fretful child and to frighten away whatever unseen presence might otherwise be drawn to disturb their sleep, a custom that blended once again practical parental comfort with an older and more watchful kind of care. Spoken prayer offered its own steady, trusted defense, and a great many households closed their day with some short private petition asking simply that no evil dream, no dark phantom, and no restless spirit be permitted to disturb the sleeper's rest through the night ahead. Such prayers, whether recited from memory, read from a treasured prayer book, or simply improvised in a parent's own quiet words over a child's bed, echo remarkably closely the very same request that would soon be sung in far grander and more formal language within the walls of the nearest monastery, where the night's true final office was only just about to begin. Even the threshold of the house itself received its own small share of protective attention in many regions, a horseshoe nailed above the door, a fresh sprig of one of the protective herbs tucked into the frame, small unremarkable gestures repeated so often across so many households that they had become, by the medieval period, simply part of what a careful family did before finally shutting the door on the night and trusting the rest of their protections, herbal, written, and spoken alike, to see them safely through until morning. It is toward one particular building, standing quiet and dark against the night sky at the edge of the town, that we must now turn our attention, for it is there, behind thick stone walls, that the whole night's careful attention to rest, to silence, and to protection found its fullest and most disciplined expression of all. The monastery gate stands closed at this hour, as closed as every other gate in the sleeping town, but within its walls the night has never truly been left to run its own course unattended. Here, more than anywhere else we have visited tonight, the whole rhythm of rest was measured, structured, and deliberately shaped, hour by hour, by a discipline unlike anything the ordinary household outside its walls had ever needed to follow. The monastic day and night together were divided into a fixed sequence of prayer services known as the canonical hours, sung or recited by the whole community gathered together at set points from before dawn until well after dark, and it was this structure, more than any bell or garden or apothecary shelf, that shaped every single thing a monk or a nun did with their waking and their sleeping hours alike. Nothing in a monastery's day happened outside this steady, repeating framework. The last of these services before the community finally retired for the night was called Compline, a name drawn from the Latin for completion, marking, quite literally, the completing and closing of the day's whole round of prayer, sung by candlelight in the last hour, before full darkness. Compline carried a tone noticeably different from the busier, more active offices of the daylight hours, quiet, unhurried, and turned entirely toward rest. Among the psalms and hymns sung at Compline, One in particular spoke directly and unmistakably to the night that lay immediately ahead, a hymn asking, in careful measured Latin verse, that no evil dream trouble the sleeping community, that no dark phantom or nightly terror be permitted to disturb their rest, and that they might lie down in peace and rise again, refreshed to praise God once more at the dawn. It is not difficult to hear, in these old sung words, the very same fear of the Mare and the very same hope for protected sleep that ordinary households outside the monastery walls carried into their own private prayers each night. The moment Compline ended, a discipline began that set the monastery apart from every other household we have visited tonight, a rule known as the Great Silence, under which no member of the community was permitted to speak again, for any reason beyond genuine necessity, until after the first prayers of the following morning had been completed. Conversation, however quiet, however brief, simply stopped, and it stopped completely. This silence was not treated as a small or incidental rule, but as one of the most seriously guarded practices of the entire monastic life, understood as a deliberate discipline, meant to protect the mind's peace precisely at the moment it was most vulnerable, clearing away the idle chatter and small daily distractions that might otherwise follow a person down into sleep and trouble the quality of rest or of prayer that the night was meant to hold, where some necessary communication simply could not be avoided. Monks relied instead on a carefully developed system of hand signs, a whole small silent vocabulary built up over generations, precise gestures standing in for bread or water or a request to pass a particular tool, allowing the practical business of a large communal household to continue in its smallest necessary ways, without a single word ever being spoken aloud. Once Compline and its silence had begun, the community filed in ordered quiet toward the dormitory, known in many houses as the Daughter, a long shared sleeping hall lined with simple narrow beds, each monk's space marked by little more than a thin straw-filled mattress, a single blanket, and whatever small personal items his particular rule permitted him to keep close at hand. In some stricter houses, monks retired still fully or partly dressed in their day habits, ready to rise again quickly the moment the night's call came. Measuring the passage of the night's hours without any of the mechanical clocks a much later age would take entirely for granted required its own careful ingenuity, and a monastery of any size kept at least one reliable means of tracking time through the darkness, whether a graduated candle marked along its length to burn down at a known steady rate, a sand-filled hourglass turned and watched by a designated brother, or in the wealthier and better equipped houses, a water clock whose slow steady drip marked the hours with a quiet, patient precision. Responsibility for actually watching these hours and waking the sleeping community, when the appointed time arrived, fell to a monk known as the sacristan, whose duties extended well beyond this single task, but who carried on any given night real weight resting on his shoulders. For a whole community's entire prayer schedule depended on his staying reliably awake and alert through hours when every instinct in his own tired body was surely pulling him toward the very same sleep he was tasked with interrupting for everyone else. When the appointed hour finally arrived, deep in the darkest and coldest part of the night, the sacristan made his way to the bell tower and set the great bell ringing, its sound rolling out over the sleeping dormitory, the sleeping cloister, and very often the sleeping town beyond the monastery walls as well, an unmistakable summons that every member of the community had been trained since their earliest days to answer without hesitation or complaint. This night office, known most commonly as Matins, or in some traditions as vigils, called the whole community up out of warm beds and into a cold, dimly candlelit choir, there to chant through a long sequence of psalms that could stretch, depending on the season and the particular monastic rule being followed, well over an hour before the office was finally complete. Surviving accounts describe this rising, again and again, as one of the genuinely hardest disciplines of the entire monastic life, harder by far than any daytime labor, precisely because it asked the body to surrender its deepest, most natural rest for the sake of prayer. The chanting itself, sung in the plain, unaccompanied style known as plain chant, rose and fell through the cold stone choir in long unhurried lines, voice answering voice, across the two facing rows of stalls, the whole sound settling into the building's high vaulted spaces the way smoke settles into open air. To anyone listening from beyond the walls, half asleep in their own bed, that distant chanting must have drifted through the darkness like a strange and steady kind of lullaby, sung by voices that were, at that very hour, working hard to stay fully awake themselves. Once Matins and the shorter office that generally followed it directly, known as Lauds in some traditions or joined together with it in others, had finally been completed, the community did not simply remain awake to greet the coming dawn. Instead, they returned once more to the dormitory and to their narrow beds, taking up again, in an entirely institutional and deliberately structured form, the very same broken, two-part pattern of rest that ordinary households outside the walls fell into quite naturally, and without any rule at all. A first sleep before midnight, a wakeful watch given over here to formal prayer, rather than quiet fireside conversation, and a second sleep carrying the community onward toward the true dawn. That true dawn arrived with its own dedicated office, sung as the first grey light finally began to show along the horizon. Its psalms and hymns turned deliberately toward praise and thanksgiving for the new day now beginning, closing, in effect, the same long circle that had opened the evening before with Compline's quiet plea for a peaceful night. Between one dawn office and the next lay an entire disciplined night, carefully measured, carefully interrupted, and carefully returned to, hour by deliberate hour. It is worth remembering, standing here at the edge of the monastery's silent cloister, with the last note of that dawn office still fading into the stone above us, that the very same bells calling this community through its ordered night also reached, quite audibly, the ordinary households scattered across the surrounding town, and a great many townsfolk who owned no clock and consulted no learned physician nonetheless shaped their own more informal sleeping and waking hours around the sound of these same monastic bells, rung faithfully through fair weather and foul, night after night, for as long as anyone could remember. This quiet monastic rhythm, from Compline's gentle plea to Matins' cold chanted psalms, and on to Lauds greeting the light, stands as one of the most disciplined answers this whole night has shown us, treating rest not as an afterthought to the day's real business, but as work every bit as serious and every bit as worthy of careful attention as anything accomplished in the light. There remain, even so, a small handful of threads still loose in our hands tonight, a few last remedies, and a few last quiet corners we have not yet properly visited, and before we let this long evening finally close for good, let us gather them in as well. Not every bed in the medieval world settled into its night the same way, and before we let the hour carry us on toward its final close, it is worth pausing to notice just how differently this whole long procession of remedies and rituals actually reached the very grandest and the very humblest households of the age. A king's bed was, in the fullest sense, never simply a piece of furniture at all, but something closer to a small formal institution of its own, tended by an entire household department devoted to nothing else. Grooms of the bedchamber, esquires assigned specifically to the royal bed, and a small hierarchy of trusted servants oversaw its making each night according to a fixed and carefully guarded procedure. Testing the mattress by rolling upon it themselves before the sovereign ever lay down, a genuine security measure against anything hidden among the bedding. The royal bed itself, hung with the richest curtains a treasury could afford, silk or fine wool, dyed in the most expensive colors of the age, and often embroidered with the household's own heraldic symbols, stood as a visible, unmistakable statement of status quite apart from its practical function. And in the grandest courts of the period, a monarch might even receive certain trusted visitors while still seated upon it, turning what was, for every other household in this night's long story, a private and sheltered space, into something closer to a small public stage. Even the royal bedtime remedies themselves, the possets, the spiced hypocras, the sleep pillows scented with the costliest lavender, and the rarest imported spices, were often prepared under the direct oversight of a personal physician retained for no other household in the kingdom. A luxury of individual medical attention that stood in the starkest possible contrast to the shared, informal, neighborly medicine that served almost everyone else in this story we have been following tonight. At the opposite end of this same wide spectrum, a peasant household's night looked, in almost every practical respect, considerably more modest, and often considerably more crowded. A single room frequently housed an entire family together, parents and children sharing what warmth could be gathered from a low fire and from each other's bodies pressed beneath whatever blankets the household owned. And in the coldest regions and the coldest seasons, livestock were sometimes brought indoors as well, sharing the same roof and, indirectly, the same warmth with the sleeping family close beside them. For a peasant household, most of the remedies we have walked through tonight were simply out of reach, the costly saffron and the imported spices belonging to a different world entirely, and rest instead was built from whatever the immediate surroundings could offer freely. A bundle of hedgerow herbs gathered without cost, a straw pallet refreshed each harvest, a warm posset made rarely and only with real effort, and above all else, the simple, unpurchased comfort of bodies gathered close together against a long cold night. And yet it would be a mistake to imagine that comfort itself, in the fullest sense the word can carry, belonged only to the wealthy. Surviving accounts, and the folk remedies that have reached us across the centuries, suggest a peasant household's rest, however plain its physical circumstances, was wrapped in every bit as much careful, deliberate attention as a king's. The very same herbs gathered at dusk, the very same charms hung against the Mare, the very same watch kept through the deep hours of the night. practiced not because any physician had prescribed them, but because a mother, a grandmother, or a neighbor had passed the knowledge along, one quiet evening at a time, exactly as such knowledge had always traveled. Between these two extremes stood the great broad middle of medieval society, the merchants, the craftsmen, the smaller landholders and their families, whose households could generally afford a feather bolster, if not a full feather bed, a modest store of common herbs, if not saffron, a simple posset on special occasions, if not a nightly hypocras. And it was this middle tier of households, numerous and varied across every town and village, that in practice carried forward the greatest and most enduring share of the ordinary remedies we have gathered together throughout this whole long night. The turning of the year itself reshaped this whole picture again and again, for a medieval household's night looked genuinely different depending on the season. And the long dark months of winter asked something quite different of a sleeper than the short bright nights of high summer ever did. In deep winter, with darkness falling in the mid-afternoon and not lifting again until well past what would now be considered a reasonable hour to rise, households simply slept longer, following the sun's own drastically shortened day, almost without conscious choice. Summer reversed this pattern entirely, and the long working days of the harvest season, in particular, compressed sleep into whatever narrow hours the fields themselves allowed. Farm households rising with first light and working until the very last of it faded, leaving only a short true night for rest before the whole demanding cycle began again the following morning. It was, in the plainest terms, an agricultural rhythm, rather than a fixed clock that shaped how much sleep a working household actually managed across the turning seasons of the year. The remedies themselves shifted gently with this same seasonal turn, warming spiced possets and the heavier hypocras favored through the long cold nights of winter, when a body genuinely needed the extra heat, while the cooling lettuce waters and light violet syrups we discussed earlier found their truest, most welcome use through the close, restless nights of high summer, when the trouble was rarely too little warmth, but very often too much. One single night in the whole turning year carried a particular and widely shared significance for the gathering of protective and medicinal herbs, the short warm evening marking the height of midsummer, when the sun stood at its longest reach, and its power, in the old herbalist's understanding, was believed to pass most fully into every growing plant touched by its light. Herbs gathered on this one night, and very often specifically at the stroke of midnight, marking its very center, were trusted above all others gathered at any different point in the year, their protective and medicinal strength considered at its absolute highest. Households across a great many regions marked this same midsummer night with small bonfires, herb-gathering expeditions by torchlight, and the hanging of freshly cut protective bundles above doors and windows, a single concentrated evening of activity that supplied, in many households, the greater part of an entire year's store of the very charms and remedies we spoke of earlier in connection with the Mare and with troubled dreams. There was, alongside this bright midsummer custom, an older and quieter belief attached to the very deepest and darkest stretch of the winter year as well, a lingering sense in the folk memory of several northern regions that the longest nights carried their own particular weight, worth meeting with extra care, extra warmth, and an extra measure of whatever protective herb or charm a household kept close at hand, as though the whole turning world itself needed a little more careful tending precisely at its darkest hour, exactly as a tired body needs a little more careful tending at the darkest hour of its own long night. There remains one more gathering of herbs we have not yet spoken of tonight, and it happened not quietly in a private garden at dusk, but openly once a year, before the whole watching congregation of a parish church, blending the careful herbal knowledge we have followed all evening with a blessing no apothecary alone could ever have offered. In late summer, on a feast day set aside in honor of the harvest and of the herbs themselves, households across a great many regions gathered together whatever plants their gardens and the surrounding fields could offer, bound into a single generous bundle, sometimes numbering as few as 7 distinct herbs, and sometimes, in certain regions and among certain devout households, stretching to as many as 77, each variety chosen with real care and real purpose. Chamomile and lavender found their place in nearly every such bundle, alongside wheat stalks for the harvest itself, and very often valerian hops, and the other calming herbs already so familiar to us from tonight's long walk through the Physic garden, gathered now not for the still room alone, but to be carried, bundle in hand, to the church door. There, before the assembled parish, a priest moved among the gathered bundles with a small vessel of holy water, sprinkling each one in turn, asking a formal blessing over the herbs that the whole community had brought. A public ceremony that joined the quiet private craft of the herbalist to the larger, shared faith of the entire village standing together in the late summer light. Once blessed, a bundle was carried home and hung to dry in exactly the same rafters where the unblessed bundles of any ordinary season already hung, but it was set apart in the household's own understanding, trusted to carry a particular protective strength beyond its ordinary medicinal one, kept sometimes for a full year until the following feast day brought a fresh bundle to replace it, and burned, in some regions, a pinch at a time through the passing months, its smoke released quietly into a sick room or a restless household, as both a medicine and a small act of continued devotion. Wealthier households, able to reach further afield for their materials, favored an entirely different kind of fragrant smoke for a bedchamber troubled by restlessness, burning small measured pieces of frankincense or myrrh. Resins carried an enormous distance along the same long trade roads that brought saffron and true cinnamon to the apothecary's shelf, their heavy sweet smoke believed to calm a troubled room and settle an anxious mind as surely as any herb steeped into a drinkable tea. A simpler, far more common trouble kept a great many ordinary sleepers awake, with no need for any elaborate remedy at all, and a nagging toothache, aching steadily through the quiet hours when every other distraction of the day had fallen away, was answered by households across every level of society with the same small, reliable comfort. A whole clove pressed gently against the aching tooth, its numbing oil offering real if temporary relief, a remedy so simple and so effective that it required no physician, no costly ingredient, and no elaborate preparation at all, only the clove itself, already resting quietly in the very same spice jar that flavored a warm evening posset. It is a fitting small note to close on in these last minutes before this long night's procession of remedies finally comes to its end. that so much of what we have gathered together tonight, from the humblest clove to the costliest saffron thread, from a blessed bundle of harvest herbs to the sacristan's own carefully watched candle, drew on exactly the same patient, careful attention, applied at every level of medieval and early modern society, to the same simple and enduring hope that whatever kept a person from their rest might be gently, patiently, and without any great fuss, coaxed away until sleep could finally return. One last quiet visit remains before we let this whole long evening finally settle, and it takes us not to any single herb or drink, but to a small corner of the monastery grounds we have not yet properly walked through, a row of woven straw hives set along a sheltered garden wall, humming softly even now in the last warmth of the day. Nearly every monastery and every well-established household of any size kept its own small apiary, tending skep hives woven from twisted straw and set carefully facing the morning sun, and the honey these bees produced across a long summer season was, quite simply, the single most important sweetener available to the entire medieval world, reaching into nearly every remedy this whole long night has already carried us through. It was honey, more often than any other ingredient, that turned a bitter dried root or a sharp-tasting syrup into something a household could actually bring itself to swallow, worked patiently into the poppy syrup and the violet syrup we spoke of earlier, sweetening the warm posset and the simple milk given to a fretful child, and binding the ground herbs of an electuary into that same soft honeyed paste we saw resting in careful rows of gallipots along the apothecary's own shelf. Honey carried a second, quieter virtue beyond its simple sweetness as well, for households of the period had long noticed, through nothing more than careful practical observation, that a remedy preserved in honey seemed to keep far longer and resist spoiling far better than one preserved in almost any other way, a natural preservation that let a still room's careful summer labor remain safely usable through an entire long winter of restless nights. Beeswax, gathered alongside the honey itself and carefully rendered clean of every trace of comb and impurity, produced the finest and most highly prized candles a household could own, burning cleaner, steadier, and very nearly free of the acrid smoke that came from cheaper tallow candles rendered instead from animal fat. It was beeswax, more than any other single material, that lit the scriptorium's long copying evenings we spoke of a little earlier, and it was very often beeswax alone that a monastery reserved for its own altar and its most important nighttime reading, tallow being judged good enough for the ordinary business of an evening, but not quite good enough for work considered truly important. A household's own more ordinary candles and rushlights dipped repeatedly in melted tallow until a sufficient thickness had built up along a simple twisted wick, burned considerably cheaper than beeswax, but carried real costs of their own, a stronger smoke, an unsteady guttering flame, and a smell that lingered afterward in close, poorly ventilated rooms. One further quiet reason so many households genuinely preferred, whenever the fading light allowed it, to finish their evening small tasks without any artificial light at all. Mead, the honeyed wine already mentioned once tonight as a simpler cousin to the grander spiced hypocras, deserves one final word here as well, for it stood, in a great many households across the whole medieval world, as the single most accessible fermented drink available to anyone who kept even a modest number of hives, offered at the close of an ordinary evening, with none of the ceremony a costly imported wine required. Its own gentle warmth, carrying a tired household the last small distance toward bed. Beekeeping itself was never treated as a small or careless undertaking, and a monastery's bee garden was tended with real seasonal discipline, hives checked and cared for through the spring and summer months, honey harvested carefully in late summer, without ever taking so much that the colony itself would struggle through the coming winter, and the whole slow, careful cycle repeated again, year after year, feeding directly into nearly every sweetened remedy, every beeswax candle, and every honeyed cup that this long night's story has already carried us through. It is a fitting thread to have saved for nearly the very end of this evening, for honey, quiet and golden and easily overlooked, beside the more dramatic poppy and mandrake and saffron we have already met tonight, was in truth woven through nearly every single remedy in this whole long procession, sweetening the bitterest cures, preserving the most delicate syrups, and lighting, in its own patient beeswax form, the very candles by which so much of this night's knowledge was first written down and carried forward to reach you now. Before we let the night carry us any further toward its close, there remains one small drawer of the apothecary's own shelf we have not yet properly opened, the one holding the costliest and most carefully guarded spice in the entire cabinet, and it deserves, given how often it has already crossed our path tonight, a fuller telling of its own. Saffron came from the dried stigmas of a small autumn flowering crocus. 3 slender threads plucked by hand from the center of each individual bloom, and the sheer scale of labor this required is almost difficult to hold in the mind even now. It took many thousands of flowers, each picked at dawn before the petals could wilt in the day's growing heat, to produce even a single modest ounce of the dried spice, and this staggering ratio of labor to yield made saffron, weight for weight, one of the most expensive substances an apothecary or a spice merchant could ever hope to keep on a shelf. Beyond its rich golden color and its distinctive faintly honeyed bitterness, saffron carried a specific and much valued medical reputation of its own within the Physic tradition, believed capable of lifting a heavy or melancholy spirit, and in smaller measured doses stirred into a posset or a syrup, of easing the particular restlessness that seemed to come from a troubled mind rather than a troubled body. A physician treating a patient whose sleeplessness he judged to spring from sorrow or low spirits reached for saffron more readily than for almost any other single remedy on his shelf. Its enormous value made saffron, unsurprisingly, one of the most heavily regulated and most frequently counterfeited goods of the entire medieval spice trade, and the city of Nuremberg, a major center of the saffron trade in the German lands, enacted a code of law dealing specifically and severely with saffron fraud, punishing merchants caught adulterating or falsifying the spice with penalties as harsh as any the medieval legal system knew. A stark and telling measure of just how seriously an entire city took the integrity of this one small golden thread. Nutmeg, already familiar to us from its place atop a warm evening posset, carried its own quieter cautionary reputation alongside its pleasant, warming fragrance. For physicians of the period had already begun to notice, through simple repeated observation, that a larger than usual dose could bring on strange vivid dreams, a kind of light-headed intoxication, and, in the most extreme cases, a genuine and troubling confusion of the senses. It stood in this respect as a smaller, gentler echo of the same double-edged caution that shadowed poppy and mandrake, a reminder that even the mildest seeming spice on the shelf deserved a measured, careful hand. Mace, the lacy reddish husk that surrounds the nutmeg seed before it is stripped away and dried separately, offered a related but distinctly milder warmth of its own, prized by cooks and physicians alike for a flavor close to nutmegs but softer at the edges, and it found its own regular place in the same warming. Comforting preparations, the possets and spiced wines, that carried a tired household toward its rest. There were gentler and far more affordable comforts to be found on the same shelf as well, and no household needed Saffron's ruinous expense to enjoy a pleasant, calming cup before bed. Elder trees, growing wild along hedgerows and field edges across much of the medieval world, offered up broad clusters of small white flowers each early summer, gathered and dried for a tea valued for its gentle, soothing warmth and its usefulness against the restlessness that so often accompanied a feverish chill. Linden trees, their pale fragrant blossoms gathered in a similar fashion each summer, produced a tea prized in many regions above almost any other simple flower water for its calming effect on a racing or anxious mind, steeped and sipped slowly in the last quiet hour before bed, its faint honeyed fragrance filling a small room with something close to the scent of the tree itself standing in full bloom. Sweet woodruff, a low-growing woodland herb with small white star-shaped flowers, released its true fragrance only once cut and left to dry, a sweet hay-like scent that intensified rather than faded with drying. And bunches of it were hung through a household, not only for the pleasure of that fragrance, but for a mildly calming effect noted in more than one period herbal. Its dried leaves sometimes steeped directly into wine for a fragrant late spring drink enjoyed at the close of a warm evening. Meadowsweet, its cream-colored flower clusters gathered from damp meadows and riverbanks through the summer months, carried a similarly gentle reputation, its faintly almond-like sweetness making it a pleasant addition to a bedtime tea, valued as much for its agreeable taste as for any single dramatic effect. One more small quiet contributor to the whole broad tradition of gentle, everyday herbal comfort that surrounded a medieval household's approach to rest. For a household with a little honey to spare, an evening cup of mead, wine fermented slowly from honey rather than grapes, offered its own warming comfort, often flavored further with whichever of these gentler herbs a household happened to have on hand. A simple, affordable cousin to the grander spiced hypocras enjoyed by wealthier tables, closing out an ordinary evening with much the same warmth, if considerably less ceremony. There is one further room within the monastery walls we have not yet visited tonight, set a little apart from the main dormitory and kept, by long custom, rather more gently than the rest of the community's own quarters, and it deserves a quiet visit before we finally turn toward the close of this long night together. This was the infirmary, the place set aside for any member of the community who fell seriously ill, and it operated, in more ways than one, by an entirely different set of rules than the rest of monastic life, where the ordinary dormitory offered only a thin straw pallet and a single blanket. The infirmary's beds were softer, its portions of food more generous, and its residents excused from the strict fasting and the demanding daily labor that shaped every other corner of the community's life. Attached to the infirmary, and tended with particular care by a monk trained specifically for the role, grew its own small dedicated herb garden, planted with many of the same cooling and calming plants we walked past in the Physic garden earlier tonight, but grown here in smaller, more concentrated beds meant to serve the infirmary's more immediate and more constant needs. The infirmarian, as this monk was known, bore a genuinely different kind of responsibility than the sacristan who had woken us for the night office, tasked with keeping a careful, patient watch over the community's sick, and this watch very often extended through the night itself, sitting beside a fevered or gravely ill patient long after the rest of the monastery had returned to its ordered rounds of sleeping and waking, where the wider community counted its candles carefully, mindful of both cost and the discipline of a simple life. The infirmary was granted a quiet exception, and a single candle was very often kept burning through the entire night beside a seriously ill patient, its small steady flame a practical necessity for anyone keeping watch, and perhaps, too, a small deliberate comfort offered to a patient who might otherwise have faced a long frightened darkness entirely alone. For a patient nearing the very end of life, the infirmarian's remedies shifted gently away from any hope of cure and towards something closer to simple comfort: softened bedding, warmed posset sweetened generously with honey, and often the same gentle cooling herbs: lettuce water, chamomile, a little poppy syrup measured with particular tenderness, offered now not to hasten a return to daily labor, but simply to ease whatever restlessness or discomfort remain, allowing a final rest to come as peacefully as the whole night's accumulated wisdom could manage to make it. It is a quiet, tender note to have found tucked away within an otherwise disciplined and orderly institution, and it reminds us, perhaps better than anything else we have gathered tonight, that every single remedy in this long procession, from the plainest cup of lettuce water to the costliest thread of saffron, ultimately answered to the very same simple human wish that whoever needed rest, for whatever reason, in whatever circumstance, might find it a little more gently than they otherwise would have. Not every sleeper in this long story was resting beneath their own familiar roof tonight, and before we let the hour draw us toward its final close, it is worth following, for just a little while, the road itself, and the particular kind of rest it offered to those who found themselves far from home when darkness fell. An inn standing along a well-traveled road offered, for whatever coin a traveler could spare, a bed for the night, though what exactly that bed amounted to varied enormously from one establishment to the next. The most fortunate guests were shown to a small private chamber with a proper bed, not unlike the one we visited earlier in an ordinary household, curtained, bolstered, and warmed if the season demanded it, while more modest travelers made do with a shared common room, a pallet of fresh straw laid directly on the floor alongside several other wary strangers, all of them making the best of whatever rest the night allowed. A good innkeeper understood hospitality as a genuine professional duty rather than a mere courtesy, and the warm posset already familiar to us from earlier in the night found one of its most reliable and welcome homes exactly here, offered freely to a cold, tired arrival as both a comfort and, quietly, a small advertisement of the house's own generosity, the kind of gesture a satisfied traveler would remember and mention to the next fellow traveller, asking where to find a decent bed along that particular stretch of road. Pilgrims, travelling often in considerable numbers along the great established routes that crisscrossed the medieval world toward one shrine or another, relied on an entirely different and rather more organized system of overnight care, for monasteries and religious houses along these routes maintained dedicated guest quarters, known in the language of the time as a hospice, built and staffed specifically to receive travelers whose journey was undertaken for devotion rather than trade or business. It is from this very word, and from this very practice of receiving the tired and the sick beneath a religious roof, that our own modern word hospital descends directly, carrying within it the memory of an institution whose earliest and most basic purpose was simply this: offering a safe bed and a measure of quiet, attentive care to anyone who arrived exhausted, unwell, or far from any home of their own. A pilgrim arriving at such a hospice, after a long day's walk, might be offered, alongside a simple meal and a straw pallet, exactly the same gentle remedies we have already met tonight in other settings. A cup of chamomile or lettuce water for a restless stomach unused to the road's rough fare, a warmed posset against the evening's chill, and very often the same quiet, watchful care an infirmarian showed his own sick brothers, extended now to a complete stranger simply because the rule of the house required, and its own genuine charity encouraged, exactly this kind of welcome. Towns of any real size also maintained their own more secular version of this same care for travelers and for the poor who had no household of their own to return to each night. Almshouses and guild-sponsored lodgings offering a bed, a meal, and often a small measure of basic medicine to whoever genuinely needed it. Funded by the charitable giving of wealthier townsfolk and administered, in many cases, by the very same craft guilds that also regulated trades like the apothecary's own shop we visited earlier tonight. There is a real and worthwhile thread connecting all of this scattered hospitality, from the humblest roadside inn to the grandest monastic hospice, back to everything else this long night has already shown us. For the same careful, unhurried attention a household gave its own sleeping members was, again and again, extended outward to strangers as well, the very same herbs, the very same warm cups, the very same quiet watchfulness offered freely to anyone whose own long day had simply left them, for whatever reason, far from their own familiar bed. As the medieval period drew slowly toward its close and gave way, gradually and unevenly across different regions, to the early modern world that followed it, a great many of the customs we have walked through together tonight continued on largely unchanged. The same herbs still gathered in the same gardens, the same possets still warmed over the same kind of fire. But the careful old measuring of the night itself, kept for so many centuries by candle marks and sand-filled glasses and the patient watching of a monastery's sacristan, slowly began to answer to a new and increasingly precise kind of instrument. Mechanical clocks, first appearing in the towers of the wealthiest cathedrals and town halls toward the latter part of the medieval period, struck their bells at fixed, unwavering intervals regardless of season or weather. A new and remarkably exact voice, added to the older chorus of curfew bells and monastic hours that had governed a sleeping town for so long. Where a candle clock burned a little faster on a draughty night and a little slower on a still one, This new mechanism kept an hour that never lengthened or shortened with the turning seasons at all. It would take a very long while yet, stretching well beyond the years this particular night of ours belongs to, before that new fixed and unwavering hour fully reshaped the older, gentler rhythms we have spent this whole evening exploring together. The natural first sleep and its quiet watching hour, the dusk-gathered herb, and the candle burned down to its own soft, irregular measure. For now, on this particular night, those older rhythms still hold, unhurried and entirely their own, exactly as they had held for centuries before any mechanical bell first learned to strike. Long before any of tonight's remedies ever reached the careful, patient page of a scribe's manuscript, they passed, far more often, through an entirely different and far less visible kind of transmission. One hand to another, one quiet evening at a time, and it is worth pausing here, in these last unhurried minutes, to consider exactly how that older and gentler kind of teaching actually worked. A young girl growing up in an ordinary medieval household learned the still room's whole craft, not from any book at all, but simply by standing beside her mother or her grandmother, evening after evening, handing across a bundle of drying lavender, watching the small copper still coax its slow fragrant drops, and asking, as children always do, why this particular herb and not another? Why this measure and not a larger one? The answers she received, offered in whatever plain, unhurried words her teacher happened to use, carried forward a whole accumulated inheritance of careful trial and careful observation that no single written page could ever have fully captured. This same quiet apprenticeship shaped the midwife's own considerable knowledge as well, passed from an older woman already trusted by an entire village to a younger one gradually taking on more and more of the work herself, watching first, assisting next, and only slowly, over years of steady practice, coming to hold that same trusted place herself, carrying forward not only the practical skills of her calling, but the whole gentle library of nursery remedies, coddles, swaddling methods, and soothing songs we spoke of a little earlier tonight. Even within the more formal walls of an apothecary shop, where a written shorthand of Latin abbreviations governed every labeled jar along the shelf, the true heart of an apprentice's training remained stubbornly practical rather than purely bookish, learned through the actual repeated motion of grinding a particular root to exactly the right fineness, of judging by color and by smell alone whether a syrup had thickened enough, of watching again and again precisely how a master apothecary's steady hand moved across his small brass scales before he finally trusted the young apprentice to weigh out a measure entirely on his own. Much of this knowledge, precisely because it lived chiefly in hands and in memory rather than on any written page, has left frustratingly few traces for later ages to recover in full. And a great deal of what any single village genuinely knew about easing a restless night has almost certainly been lost entirely, remembered clearly enough by the last person who ever practiced it, and then, once that person had passed on, without a ready apprentice of her own to receive it, simply gone. What has reached us across the long centuries between that older world and this particular evening is, in this light, something genuinely precious, however ordinary and unremarkable each individual remedy might seem taken entirely on its own. A chamomile tea, a warmed posset, a sprig of rosemary tucked beneath a pillow. Each one represents a small surviving thread from what was once a far larger, far richer fabric of quiet, patient, hand-to-hand teaching, most of which has long since slipped away beyond any hope of full recovery. It seems a fitting thought to carry with us into these final closing minutes, that the very act of listening to any of it now, gathered together and passed along once more in this particular telling, continues, in its own small modern way, exactly the same old chain that carried a mother's careful still room craft down to her daughter, and a master apothecary's steady practiced hand down to his watching apprentice. One unhurried evening, and one small patient lesson at a time. Before we let this long night finally draw to its close, it is worth pausing once more to ask a quieter question, one that has been sitting patiently behind everything we have gathered together so far tonight. How is it that any of this, the garden and its herbs, the sponge and the dwale, the posset and the watch and the bells of the night office, has survived at all across so many centuries down to this particular evening and this particular listening? The answer lies, for the most part, in a small, quiet room, not unlike the still room we visited earlier, though this one held ink and parchment rather than dried herbs, a scriptorium, set aside within a monastery or a wealthy household for the slow, patient work of copying. It was here, by candlelight, that a monk or a trained scribe bent over a sloped wooden desk, copying out, letter by careful letter, the medical texts, the herbals, and the household remedies that would otherwise have vanished entirely from memory within a generation or two. This work was neither quick nor easy, and a single substantial manuscript might occupy a skilled scribe for months, sometimes for years. His candle burning low beside him through many long evening hours, as he worked his way steadily through page after page of another writer's careful observations, copying not only the words themselves, but very often the small painted illustrations that accompanied them, a poppy rendered in careful color, a mandrake's forked root sketched with real attention to its strange human shape. The materials themselves demanded almost as much patience as the copying. Parchment, made from carefully prepared animal skin, scraped, stretched, and dried until it would hold ink cleanly, was costly enough that even a wealthy monastery used it with real care, and the ink itself, mixed often from oak galls iron and a binding agent, had to be prepared fresh and used steadily before it thickened or spoiled. A single small error, a smudge, a skipped line, a misread word carried forward from an already flawed earlier copy, could travel forward through every subsequent copy made from that particular manuscript. A small crack running quietly through centuries of otherwise careful transmission. It is worth remembering, listening to any of the specific remedies and recipes we have gathered together tonight, that each one reached us only because some particular scribe, on some particular evening now lost entirely to time, judged it worth the very real labor of copying out by hand, candle burning steadily beside him, when he might just as easily have judged it not worth the effort and let it pass instead into silence. A great many remedies, undoubtedly, did pass into exactly that silence, practiced quietly for a generation or two within a single household or a single village, trusted and relied upon by people who had no particular reason to write any of it down, and lost, in the end, simply because nobody happened to be sitting in a scriptorium on the right evening with the patience and the parchment to preserve it. What has reached us tonight, across this whole long procession of 100 remedies and more, represents only a fraction, and very likely only a small fraction, of everything the medieval and early modern world actually knew and actually practiced concerning sleep. Illuminated herbals, the most beautifully made of these surviving manuscripts, paired careful written description with equally careful painted illustration. Each plant rendered in colors mixed by hand from ground minerals and plant dyes. Gold leaf sometimes applied in small careful patches to highlight a particularly important passage or a particularly valuable remedy. A reader turning through such a manuscript today, in whatever careful climate-controlled library now holds it, is looking at colors mixed and applied by a single patient hand many centuries ago, working by exactly the same kind of candlelight that features so often throughout the whole story we have told tonight. Household remedy books, less grand than the great illuminated herbals, but every bit as valuable in their own quieter way, were kept and added to across generations within a single family, a grandmother's handwriting giving way, page by page, to her daughters and then her granddaughters, each new hand adding a fresh remedy learned from a neighbor, a traveling healer, or simple hard-won experience, until a single worn volume held within its covers the accumulated practical wisdom of an entire family line, stretching back further than any single living member could clearly remember. It is from exactly this patchwork of surviving sources, the great formal medical treatises of trained physicians, the beautifully illustrated herbals of wealthy patrons, and the plain, well-worn household books passed down through ordinary families, that everything we have gathered together across this long night has ultimately been drawn, each fragment surviving by little more than chance and the patient labor of someone, somewhere, who happened to think it worth the candle it took to write down. There is something worth sitting with in these last quiet minutes before we finally close, in the simple fact that a scribe's small steady candle, burning alone through a long copying evening centuries ago, has carried this knowledge forward across so much distance and so much time that it now reaches you, here, tonight, in whatever room you happen to be resting in, by an entirely different kind of light altogether. The garden has long since grown over. The apothecary's shop, the monastery, the narrow Curfew streets, all of it passed away long ago into the ordinary slow turning of history. And yet here it still is, patient and quiet, exactly the way a well-kept remedy always was, waiting simply for the moment someone needed it again. The bell has finished ringing now, and the last of its low sound has faded away into the dark above the rooftops, and there is nothing left for us to do tonight but let this whole long walk finally settle, the way every other tired thing we have met this evening has eventually settled into a slow and unhurried close. We began, if you can still remember it, at the low wooden gate of a walled Physic garden, just as the light was leaving the sky, and we have been walking quietly and without any real hurry ever since. Let the whole of that long walk drift gently back through your mind now, not to be remembered in any careful order, but simply to pass once more, like the last of a fragrant smoke thinning slowly in still evening air. The garden itself, its raised beds cooling in the dusk, poppy standing pale among the ordinary cabbages, valerian untidy against the wall, hops climbing their trellis, lavender lining the path in its low violet haze, chamomile spreading soft beneath careless feet, and Mandrake, apart in its own quiet corner, kept its whole 100 small treasures safely gathered for another night. The still room, warm from the kitchen fire beyond its wall, hung thick with drying bundles, turning slowly from green to brown, its small coppers still coaxing lavender and rose and chamomile drop by patient drop into fragrant water, its shelves of sealed clay jars marked in a careful hand against the long forgetting of an ordinary winter. The apothecary's shop, its rows of glazed gallipots catching the single candle's light, its mortar and pestle worn smooth by decades of steady grinding, its small brass scales weighing out grains and scruples with a precision that meant, quite literally, the difference between healing and harm, and its young apprentice, still learning, behind the worn wooden counter, the sleeping sponge, wrapped once in linen and lifted down from its high, seldom disturbed shelf, its long patient preparation, its quiet dried waiting, and its soft merciful vapor, breathed in slowly through the nose until pain itself, for a little while, simply stopped mattering. Dwale, in its small stoppered flask, boar's bile and hemlock and bryony, and poppy and wine, measured with such careful, anxious attention, a drink that asked more trust of a frightened patient than almost anything else this long night has offered. The poppy itself, its milky sap darkening slowly overnight into resin, its sweetened syrup kept ready through the coldest months, its image nodding quietly in the margins of manuscripts that had nothing at all to do with medicine, and its own honest double nature, mercy in a careful hand, danger in a careless one. Mandrake, forked and human-shaped beneath the soil, gathered by some accounts with chalk circles and stopped ears and a dog straining forward on its cord, carried afterward as both a genuine surgical remedy and a small carved charm kept close in a box for luck. Valerian, its scent that cats adored and most people found faintly unpleasant, hung over door frames for protection as much as for sleep, and hops, discovered first for keeping Al from sorrowing and only slowly, patiently, for the pillow beneath a restless head. Lettuce, mild in the garden bed, and stronger in its wild hedgerow cousin, boiled down into a plain cooling water, trusted above almost anything else this whole Physic garden had to offer, cooling a hot, troubled mind the way the old humoral wisdom always promised it would. The warm posset, milk curdled into soft curds with oil or wine, spiced with nutmeg or cinnamon or, for the fortunate few, a costly thread of saffron, passed from hand to hand in the last quiet hour, before an entire household finally climbed toward bed. The bed itself, its feathers or its straw marking a household's whole place in the world, its warming pan hissed briskly beneath cold sheets, its heavy curtains drawn close against the draughts, its small woolen cap pulled down snugly over tired ears, and its cradle rocking steadily somewhere nearby to the low tuneless comfort of an old repeated lullaby. The first sleep, arriving not long after dark, and the quiet watching hour that so naturally followed it, filled with prayer, or soft conversation, or a little mending done half by feel in the dying firelight, entirely unremarkable, entirely expected, entirely unafraid. The dream books consulted by candlelight, the old fear of the Mare and its crushing unseen weight, and the rue, the vervain, and the sun-gathered St. John's wort hung close by the bed, to keep every restless spirit safely at bay through the dark hours, the curfew bell rolling out over the whole sleeping town, every household banking its fire beneath a small domed cover, the watchman calling the hours softly through empty streets, and the whole town settling together, door by latch door, into the very same rest. The monastery beyond the town wall, its Compline hymn asking gently that no evil dream disturb the sleeping brothers, its great silence falling the moment that hymn was finished, its sacristan keeping his own lonely watch over the candle marks and the turning hourglass until the deep bell finally called the whole community, cold and half awake, into the candlelit choir to sing. Saffron, 3 small threads plucked by hand from thousands of flowers, guarded by law as fiercely as gold, and nutmeg beside it, warm and pleasant in a careful dose, strange and troubling in too generous a hand. The infirmary's single steady candle, burning all through the night beside whoever needed it most, and the gentle remedies offered there, not to hurry a return to daily labour, but simply, patiently, to ease whatever rest remained to be had. The great difference, too, between a king's curtained and carefully tested bed and a peasant household's single shared room, and the quiet reminder that the very same careful attention, the very same herbs, the very same charms against the Mare still reached in their own way to every level of that whole wide and unequal world. The turning seasons themselves, long dark winters asking for more sleep and more warming spice, short bright summers asking for less of both, and the one bright midsummer night when every gathered herb was trusted to hold its very greatest strength. The weary traveller's welcome at a roadside inn, the pilgrim's simple bed in a monastery's own hospice, and the almshouse door standing open to anyone the night had left without a home of their own to return to. The scribe's small steady candle, burning alone through so many long copying evenings, across so many centuries, carrying every single one of these fragile remedies forward, one careful hand to the next, until they could finally reach this particular evening and this particular room, and you, and the blessed bundle of harvest herbs, sprinkled with holy water before a whole watching parish and hung afterward in the very same rafters as every ordinary bundle, one small clove pressed gently against an aching tooth, asking nothing more, in the end, than every other remedy this long night has offered, a little patience and a little mercy against whatever kept a tired body from its rest. That is the whole of it now, the entire long walk we have taken together this evening, gathered up one final time and set gently back down. There is no need to hold on to any single piece of it. Let the names drift a little further away now, the way a dried bundle's fragrance fades slowly from a rafter over the passing months, still present, still quietly working, even once you have stopped consciously noticing it at all. If you are still listening, if your eyes have not yet closed, that is perfectly all right. There is nothing left tonight that requires your attention, no remedy left to prepare, no drawer left to open, no bell left to answer. You may simply lie exactly where you are, in whatever kind of bed the modern world has given you, and let your own body do what every sleeper in this long story eventually did, sinking a little deeper, breath by breath, into its own first sleep of the night. If you should happen to stir again later, somewhere in the deep, quiet hours, you now know, better perhaps than you did at the start of this evening, exactly what that stirring is. It is not a failure of rest. It is only your own quiet watch, the very same one kept by every household we have visited tonight, a brief and entirely natural hour of half-wakefulness before sleep, patient as it has always been. comes gently back to carry you the rest of the way toward morning. The candle by this bed, wherever you are resting, is going out now. The last of the fire has been banked and covered. The garden gate is latched, the shop door is shuttered, the monastery bell has rung its final stroke for the night, and the whole long procession of 100 quiet remedies, and a good many more besides, has been set carefully back on its shelf, waiting, exactly as it always has, for whenever it might next be needed. Sleep well. The quiet apothecary will be back again soon, with another long and unhurried evening. Until then, there is nothing left to do tonight but rest.